And then it broke a branch or something. It sounded like cracking a baseball bat against a tree trunk. And I'm watching through night vision monocular without the benefit of recording capability, unfortunately. And right at that point, I shifted my position because of the smoke. Had a better vantage down where these sounds were coming from. And something broke from the shadows, as seen through night vision, and went up the slope, across the road, and into the shadows on the other side. I could see the low set head on broad shoulders and thick torso. I could see an arm move. And it was like it was gliding, that smooth, compliant gait, and then it was gone.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Backcountry Manifesto podcast. I'm your buddy out west, Hayden Samak, and today on the show we're talking to my buddy, Dr. Jeff Meldrum. Dr. Jeff Meldrum is a professor of anatomy and anthropology in the Department of Biological Sciences at Idaho State University. Really interesting thing about Dr. Jeff Meldrum, he very much loves the creature that we know as Bigfoot. And there might not be anybody more qualified to talk about him. He's appeared on the Joe Rogan podcast. He attends many conventions. That's him with Dan Aykroyd, Saturday Night Live legend. That's cool, right? Anyhow, he's on the show today. He's going to be talking to us about all sorts of really interesting Bigfoot science, Bigfoot conjecture, Bigfoot skeptics, all great stuff. He's also the author of the book Sasquatch, Legend Meets Science. And yeah, today he's talking to us. So here it is, our show with the one and only Dr. Jeff Meldrum. I've been really looking forward to this.
Likewise.
Thanks for coming on, man.
Yeah, my pleasure.
You're on your way up from Idaho to BC.
That's right.
What are you doing up in BC?
There's a conference that's organized by a local enthusiast investigator. Mm-hmm. And these have sprung up like mushrooms. They're great opportunities. Many people don't realize how much evidence there really is.
Right.
That is really quite compelling. I mean, yes, it's not conclusive. The norms, the traditions of zoological discovery require a specimen, a physical specimen,
yeah,
and eventually the establishment of a type. But short of that, there's no reason we should just sit on our hands and wait for a specimen to be dropped in our lap as curious. It's scientists who, the science starts when you have a question. Mm. And this is one of the most intriguing questions I've encountered.
So you're going up to give a presentation to a group of folks that mm-hmm. are also enthusiastic. What's interesting about you, and not a qualification that a lot of other people have who are like publicly about, Sasquatch and Bigfoot and cryptozoology in general, is that you're a bona fide anthropologist.
Right.
Your area of study dovetails in this interest in a way that I feel like gives particular credence to your thoughts, and not only that, but how you approach exploring those thoughts. Because being a professor and being an anthropologist and being an academic, there are certain things that you are tied to on principle that maybe a lot of other folks can kind of, foist off to the wayside.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So let me ask you two questions. Bigfoot or Sasquatch? And we'll talk relic hominid after that. But
Sure.
Bigfoot, Sasquatch, and what was the thing that started steering you this way? Was it an extension of, your academic interest, or was it an event?
Right. Well, Bigfoot is a term that became attached to this phenomenon, and there's different sort of legendary accounts of the origin of that. The most common was that when Jerry Crew, a member of the construction outfit working at Bluff Creek in Northern California back in the 50s, made what seems to be the first plaster cast of a footprint, to preserve a footprint in the United States at least, brought that into town. The local editor of the newspaper, Andrew Gonzoli, I believe I'm pronouncing that correctly, took a look and reportedly said, "Wow, that's a big foot."
You're like, yes, it is.
But I started using the term Sasquatch more preferentially because, in part, out of deference, as it originated out of deference to the tribal traditions, the First Nation traditions of Canada. This term was coined by J.W. Burns, who was an educator on one of the reserves there in British Columbia. And he was also a writer, aspiring writer, and wrote articles about these giant hairy people, the Sasquatch, which is kind of an anglicized version of a number of Native American names, which have some common denominators. I mean, each tribe in their own language has their own term. So Sasquatch roughly means the wild person of the woods, wild man of the woods. So it's a little bit more descriptive in that sense. It's a little more universal, a little more general of that character that, we actually find representation in literary sources all the way back to some of the earliest Western traditions. And you can find similar representations of hairy wild men even in many Eastern cultures. The Chinese Yeren, the wild man, literally translated, is remarkably similar in its description to the Sasquatch and leaves footprints that are virtually indistinguishable. So I've used Sasquatch. Even Sasquatch has become a bit commercialized, tabloid-ish, because of the popularity of the subject as a part of pop culture. Mm-hmm. And so that led to the the readoption, the resurrection really of the term relict hominoid, which was first coined by a Russian scientist, Boris Porzhnev, who was a cultural anthropologist, very interested in these stories of wild men in his country. And the term relict with a T is the preferred form of the word used in biology to make reference to a population of a species that was once much more widespread, much more common, but has now become very restricted and, may be even on the verge of extinction.
Okay, so Bigfoot is what you see on a bumper sticker. Sasquatch is what you have in casual, intelligent conversation. If you're a researcher, you call him a relict hominoid. And if you slip up and call him a relic hominoid, people will be happy that you tried.
You make the effort, yeah.
And then the following thing I want to ask you is where those footprints were first cast, that construction site, the Bush construction site, is that what it was?
Bluff Creek.
Yeah, the Bluff Creek construction site. That was kind of like the inciting event for Sasquatch and popular culture in North America. Is that fair to say?
Yes, I think that it's fair to say, because as a result of the publicity of that event and that photograph of this guy holding this 16, 17-inch plaster cast, it was on the front pages of papers all across the country. And, the public awareness of what had been transpiring actually for decades. I mean, there were stories. I mean, you can go back even to the historical newspaper accounts and so forth in the eastern states even. And they don't have the word Bigfoot, but if you search for things like wild man or gorilla, these types of
great ape of the north or something like that.
Right.
It's just
or of the Appalachian. Yeah.
This condensed
booger.
it.
Well, it was some physical evidence. You had more than just a story. Something made this footprint. Now, then it became controversial where they hoaxed. Was it just a prank? And there were some that volunteered, responsibility for that, unjustifiably, in my opinion. But and others that thought, there was something to this. Even when the footprints were first being discovered, it wasn't clear what was leaving them, if they were even authentic. If they were authentic, there were theories like, well, it's again a wild tribe of giant Indians that have escaped detection, or it was an escaped lunatic from an insane asylum. I mean, literally that was expressed. Or it was a mutated bear that walked upright. It had funny looking feet, and then there was actually a couple guys that were out there hunting for whatever this was. And they reportedly were driving back to camp. And as they rounded the corner, their headlights caught this big figure hunkered to the side of the road that stood up to its full height and in 2 steps was across the road into the trees on the other side. And they described it as a giant hairy ape. There are some who argue that if you go back to J.W. Burns' original descriptions of the Sasquatch, you might think that he was describing a race of people, humans with just long, shaggy hair on their head. But the notion of an ape-like thing, they say, was contrived later, that kind of to create a narrative. I don't think that's justifiable, because you look at some of the earliest accounts, and you got to remember, we're way before the internet, way before cable television. So the ability of these ideas to disseminate through the population was just limited to the occasional newspaper account and whatever. But whether even communication between newspaper outlets and things back in those days. So very early on, there was a report. I mean, one of the most classic stories is the account by William Rowe. And it's a very straightforward account. It's in its simplicity. It's very persuasive, because he was an amateur prospector, was out looking for kind of, the lost gold mines and so forth up there in British Columbia. And he describes hearing this sound. He was taking advantage of some of the berries, and he noticed over here's this figure. You could see it from the back, and this big, broad shoulders and head and covered with hair. And he said eventually it turned and he could see the face, and it would pull just the details he described. It would bring the branch up rather than picking the berries off with fingers. It would just picking them off. And he described the very dexterous lips, the muscular lips.
Yeah.
And the drawing that you get is this tall, husky, a robust, long-legged creature with more human-like feet and sporting a pair of breasts, human-like breasts, which was different. But the rest, the way the head was drawn, beetle brow, low forehead, sloping skull, and sort of a deep set jaws, not particularly prognathic, but a little flat nose across on a big upper lip. And I mean, it's as ape-ish as you can imagine. You look at that and you can't help think, but something, if not ape, then something like some primitive caveman, some primitive human ancestor or relative. But the Bigfoot encounter, the footprints discovered in Bluff Creek in 1958, that really emblazoned it in the U.S. Psyche. And from there, it just kind of snowballed in a way. But it's not like it started there. That's the thing.
Yeah, but there are all these. Well, I'll give you Are you a music person at all?
A little bit, yeah.
Well, you know Bob Dylan.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, well, it's like Bob Dylan didn't invent folk music, right? But like he's like a touchstone. And before that, you have Woody Guthrie, right? So like Woody Guthrie didn't invent folk music either. But so there are these
Oh, sure.
So but in this metaphor, I'm going to bring it back to this later.
Yeah.
The Bluff Creek was Woody Guthrie. Something that happened a few years later is Bob Dylan.
Yeah.
And we'll talk about that. But first, I want to know how you particularly.
Well, I don't want to steal your thunder because my touchstone was, I think, what you're leading up to. The Patterson-Gimlin film. So I was a youngster, 10 years old, in 6th grade in Spokane, Washington. And in 1969, which the film was shot in October of 67. By early 69, this was March 1st, at one of the first public showings of the film to a public venue. It had been already examined by a panel of scientists at the University of British Columbia, and then it was taken out to the Smithsonian, and a panel of scientists viewed it there. So I'm at school, and the kids, it was actually an evening program for the parents, and we're sitting in our classroom, by ourselves, waiting for our cue to go in and perform. And the kids were all abuzz because there had been this newspaper advertisement for this upcoming showing on the next Saturday. And so this just captured my imagination. I mean, I'd never heard of Bigfoot previously. And in any case, I ran home that night and got the paper out, and sure enough, there's the advert. Convinced my dad we had to go see this. And so he and I and my younger brother went to the Spokane Coliseum, sitting on the third row. Roger comes out onto the stage and introduces himself and his documentary that showcased that 60 seconds of film footage, which we saw over and over and over on a giant screen, in the auditorium there, much larger than life. And wow, what an impression that made. And so, those continue to, all those things continue to play a very significant and important role. In fact, when I'm up here at BC, my lecture is a 55-year later retrospective of the Patterson-Gimlin film, because not only the things that we have learned through improved technologies that allow us to examine the film, and unfortunately the original is no longer in existence, or right. But we have one of the projects I was involved with was the production of a composite, a very precise composite stacking of the multiple copies that are out circulating of multiple generations to allow us to sort of amplify the signal and dilute the artifacts and idiosyncrasies of individual copies of film, not of digital. So that each copy has its own little quirky bits.
But you're making a composite of something that has a lot of it.
And so, I mean, the composite doesn't provide any aha moments, any aha revelations. But what it does is things are sharper, clearer, and the researcher, the doctorate, he was a doctoral student at the time of the project, and now has a PhD in computer vision. But he also did a very precise stabilization of the film. So, I mean, it's motionless. Smooth. And so that allows us to play it for an audience and point out features now that are much more evident than when you're trying to focus on this, bouncing ball going across, or a bouncing figure. But in addition to those analyses, the advantage now we have of a 55-year retrospective is we can see how it was received against the paradigm in 1967 and the contextual understanding, and what has changed in 55 years.
Yeah.
And it's stunning because in 1967, the prevailing idea about the pattern of human evolution was this single file march. Anthropology was influenced by ecology, central to which was the niche hypothesis. That is, one species per one niche. Each species has its address defined by parameters that exclude others because through competition they would be displaced.
This thing is filling this gap.
Exactly.
Because that no other things exist.
Exactly. Hails back to a Russian microbiologist who coined what was called the competitive exclusion principle, that no two species can occupy the same niche. So anthropology thought, well, hominin, going back to the term hominin, the hominin niche, big brains, bipedalism, and above all, material culture. And that makes it an exclusive club. There can be only one representative, and
That's it, yeah.
So when they look at the film, they're already predisposed. It can't exist. So how are we going to explain why it can't exist?
But now that time has divorced us from those
Now we see the evolutionary tree as this bush with multiple species coexisting at any time in the past, and many of those branches having persisted until the present, until the recent, if not the present.
Yeah.
And so now there are hooks to hang these. And then this is one of the reasons, too, for the motivation behind coining a new term, relic hominoid, is because not all the wild men reported around the globe are Sasquatch. There are Sasquatch-like entities, species through Asia, and that's almost certainly the source of the North American Sasquatch. But in Russia, for example, there are what, in my opinion, can only be described as relic Neanderthals. Southeast Asia, we have the hobbit, Homo floresiensis, which is almost certainly a relic Australopithecine. In the Himalayas, we have the Yeti. Its footprints look like a chunky chimpanzee with a divergent big toe. So it's a relic ape. No question, it's another great ape that has just hung on in the high tropical to subtropical forests of the Himalayas. And so there's at least 4, if not more. I mean, there's a fascinating book by a gentleman named Garrett Patterson in South Africa. And they have...
It's a different Patterson than Patterson.
A different Patterson, yeah. But he makes it easy for me to remember some terrible names. But he has been doing research on reports of wild men in these rather isolated mountain ranges of South Africa that, for all intents and purposes, sound a lot like the things in Southeast Asia, another Australopithecine, in my opinion. That's so there may even be more branches, more types of wild men, of relic hominoids.
So do you know if the Patterson-Gimlin film is copyrighted? Is it trademarked and all that? Is it under wraps?
It's still contentious there because of the history of it. And,
okay, well, so, you know what?
Yeah.
I'll tell you what, we're going to risk it. This is the Patterson-Gimlin film. If you are yet to see it, and YouTube, please don't demonetize us.
Yeah.
If you are a viewer, you just saw the Patterson-Gimlin film maybe for the first time. Why was that such like a compelling, other than like the timeline, other than like the video evidence, like the first real video evidence, why is that not only compelling then, but compelling today to many, many folks?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because I actually, when I became involved in this topic, this question, investigation, I literally kind of shied away or kept at arm's length the film. I didn't want the perception that I was putting too much or undue emphasis on that one piece of evidence. I didn't want this argument to seem as if it pivoted upon that one piece of evidence. Not that I doubted that whether it was authentic or not, but I just the perception of it. But as time went on, and as I had more opportunity to study the footprint evidence, for example, to examine the 10 casts that Bob Titmus had made at the site, and
of the Patterson-Gimlin film?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I had no idea that there were casts taken there. I thought it was just that.
Oh, no, this is what, and so as a person, since it was the footprints that drew me in to this question, it was a personal experience as well as, against the backdrop of my expertise, my research emphasis, as you introduced me, a specialist in hominin human bipedalism. Mm-hmm. That includes, and in my case was prioritized, the footprint evidence of bipedalism, both the study of fossilized hominin footprints around the world, examples of that, and then in order to interpret that, a study of modern human footprints in all their variety and cultural manifestation, shod versus unshod, and so on, as well as non-human great apes, and in order to understand the intermediacy of so many of the characteristics of these fossilized hominin footprints, and to be able to examine the timing and pattern, because it wasn't like our ancestors just immediately adopted upright posture and everything changed anatomically. There were features that led out, others that lagged behind, primitive retentions and mosaicism, and eventually the modern human foot form with its distinctive characteristics like the longitudinal arch, became fixed and became expressed to the degree they are. So, yes, it was the footprints, in addition to the right and the left, which were cast by Roger Patterson at the film site, in the immediacy of that moment, and make a marvelous representation of the foot form and function. But limited somewhat. Roger made the somewhat tactical mistake of selecting the clearest, flattest, flawless examples of a right and a left. So while they make great representations of the details of the foot, and the sand on that sandbar was a kind of the grains were this angular, eroded slate rather than the kind of granitic. And so the footprints, when compressed, that substrate interlocked and held its shape remarkably well. But to the doubters,
it's like, wow, isn't it convenient that this is such a perfect footprint?
Yeah. And remarkably flat and featureless without the typical topography of a human foot with a heel and a ball and an arch. Yeah. They must be just carved out of planks. They're they're the stereotypical flat fake foot strapped to a to a hiking boot. But then, thankfully, in part, Bob Titmus, had a former California resident who was then, by this time, had relocated to British Columbia, had come down to the site, had just enough plaster that by stretching it, and he really stretched it. I mean, some of the casts are hardly more than splatter or spatter coatings of the print, but he made 10 in succession. The only problem is he didn't take metrics of the gait parameters, like the step length and straddle and everything, and didn't number the sequence even, but not that it matters. But he had 10 regardless of their quality. And so it preserved some of the quirky aspects, some of the, well, I shouldn't say quirky. It preserved the dynamic features of a very animate footprint rather than these apparent static impressions of a prosthetic.
Oh, I see.
Fake foot. So we've got those 10, and it's remarkable. I brought one example to share with you that shows a very distinctive dynamic feature, which has figured very prominently in my characterization of the distinguishing features of the Sasquatch footprint, differentiating it from a human, and in fact, in part forming the basis of the ichnotaxon, which is the taxonomic name of the footprint of a creature for which we don't have a type specimen of the creature itself.
Oh, I see.
And so that's a legitimate way to classify something related to Sasquatch when we aren't justified in
ichnotaxon.
Yes, ichnotaxon. So the
are there other examples of that?
Oh yeah,
Like
it's
what?
a whole discipline. Well, they're given names, but my focus has been quite particularly on this,
Right.
the Sasquatch. But I've interacted with people who, I mean, typically it's utilized by paleontologists, where the bones of an extinct species haven't been found, but these tracks
Oh, sure. Okay.
have not been associated. So it's just basically a way to put a handle on these and to be able to attach a description and differential diagnosis so that they can be studied and examined.
So to like continue like that example of a paleontologist, right?
Yeah.
Like it would be if you found a 6-toed dinosaur track, right? But you were like, well, we haven't found a dinosaur with a fossil that is 6 toes.
Right, exactly.
So we know that this thing
existed,
but we don't have like the physical sample.
Right.
I want to get to we're going to get to like skepticism, particularly surrounding Patterson-Gimlin. But before we do that, I think we ought to look at one of these casts.
Sure.
What do you think?
Yeah.
I'm super excited. I don't think I've ever like I've seen like Bigfoot cast after Bigfoot cast like as a as like an item, but like I've never like held one or seen one in person. I don't think.
I don't think I've ever seen it.
Oh my gosh!
So that is one of the Titmus casts, and this one is particularly significant. This, like I said, played a real important role in my assessment of the model of the Sasquatch footprint. So what some will look at and think, oh, there's an arch or it's broken in the middle.
Right there.
That's actually a pressure ridge. So it's an artifact. The foot isn't shaped that way, but you have to remember this is not.
It's not something going straight down. It's something moving.
Exactly. And it's not a model of a foot. It's a cast of the footprint.
Yeah.
And the footprint is a dynamic record of the entire step.
So if you're transferring, I'm trying to do this in front of the camera. If you're transferring weight this way, you're not going to like hop heel to heel. You're going to go and you're going to pivot. And that's why you have this.
Well, right. Well, and even more significantly, the foot of the Sasquatch is essentially, it does not have a fixed longitudinal arch like a human foot.
Okay.
It's a flat, flexible foot, which some humans have, asymptomatic flat feet or otherwise. But so you've got that entire foot in contact with the ground, but then the heel comes up first. Instead of the entire foot pivoting at the ball, the flexible foot pivots in the instep, what we call our instep, and the heel comes up, and now pressure, you can see the deepest points. Where are the deepest points on the, that's the highest point. The deepest points of the imprint.
Sure.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's
Right.
you think in reverse.
Right.
So it's right up here. Exactly.
The ball of the foot.
The forefoot. The ball would be way up here. Okay. Yeah. So the entire forefoot. I should have brought a foot skeleton to show you this better as well, but I didn't.
I got a friend who lost his foot because of a plane crash and then taxidermized it, like beetle cleaned it.
Oh, really?
So,
his skeleton?
He has his own foot just completely articulated.
Oh, my goodness. Well, that's interesting.
we could have called him up, but sorry, I didn't mean to derail you.
Yeah, no, that's quite interesting. So anyway, the heel comes up, weight's transferred through the entire forefoot, and if the substrate is of proper consistency, there's the word I was after, proper consistency, and there's the sufficient forward impulse, it will sometimes push up that speed bump you see, that pressure ridge behind, or sometimes the the substrate yields and it pushes a whole disc back into the heel.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
So you get a pressure disc instead of a pressure ridge. But you notice there's not a whole lot of imprint of the toes. Most of the forward impulse comes from the forefoot. The toes are there for traction if necessary, but if not, they are pretty much passively extended and serve other purpose. In describing this, I mean, I'm quite confident in what I've described to you because you can watch it take place in the foot of Patty on the film. You can see her heel come up first and almost reach verticality. Mm. And if it was a stiff artificial foot, a rigid prosthetic, then the rest of her foot, given the orientation of the heel, would have to stick 8 inches straight into the ground. Mm. But it's not, it's just bent. It's flexed. And we call that the mid-tarsal break. Not in the sense of like breaking a stick or damaging, but an axis of flexion, a strike of a flexion, a break. And that is the most fundamental distinction between a Sasquatch footprint and a human footprint. Now, you don't find that feature in every print because it just depends on the circumstances. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, I mean, some prints are flat as can be, but some, if they're moving, if they're changing direction. I mean, if you have experience running, or if your listeners are runners, you've heard of the terms pronation and supination.
Yeah.
So
I have a pronation problem when I run.
Yeah, exactly. And so when the foot is pronated, the arch is depressed in the human foot. Yeah. And likewise in the Sasquatch foot as well, because that midfoot is mobile. It doesn't lock into a longitudinal arch. So their feet, when pronated, leave sometimes this flat, featureless print, like the two that Roger cast, which the specialist said,
where is this one from?
This is from the Patterson-Gimlin Film site. This is one of the 10 when Titmus came back down to investigate.
Oh, right. You said this. You said this. See, they did the Titmus and the Gimlin and the Patterson.
Yes, I know.
I get all thrown around, man.
So Bob Titmus was actually a taxidermist, so he knew anatomy well.
Sure. He
was the one who actually instructed Jerry Crew on how to make a plaster cast. Jerry Crew showed up at his taxidermy shop with this piece of cardboard that he had cut out with his penknife in the shape of the footprints that were around his caterpillar, and said, "What could have made this?" And he goes, "I have no idea. I've never seen anything like that." He said, "But hey, if they show up again, take this bag of plaster with you and mix it up and make a plaster." A few days later, he shows up in town with this 16, 17-inch footprint, and that's where the story came. But anyway, I was going to say, critics have looked at that, despite the fact that you can watch the dynamic action of the foot on the film. They say, well, if that's the case, if that's not just a branch in the sand or something, then why just that one footprint? Why do all the rest? Well, it's really interesting because if you I've got 3D scans of the 10 footprint series that Titmus cast, rotate them 90 degrees, and boom, 8 out of the 10 have a observable pressure ridge. And then on top of that, I got to tell this. On top of that, I had a chance to go actually see the original Jerry Crew footprint from 1958, which when you see in the books, the picture was taken by a newspaper reporter with an old-fashioned flash bulb, if you remember those days, and a very strong illumination, which tends to make things look flat. Well, I took that original cast, took it out of the little shadow box they had it displayed in. You turn it on its side, and guess what? It has a pressure ridge just like that.
Depth.
It's just a little more subtle than that, not quite as pronounced. I went to China and to investigate the Chinese Yeren. There was a witness who had a sighting and had tracked it. He was actually a park ranger at the time. Found footprints where it had squatted down next to a spring, made a right and a left cast. They were going to unveil those for me to look at and evaluate. They before we did that, they wanted to set up for the interview and capture my initial
reaction
to it. But I had given Mr. Yuan, the witness, my article, which actually was the paper on the ichnotaxonomy, which featured this particular print quite prominently in a figure that showed it with three angled views to illustrate the form of the pressure ridge. He couldn't speak English, couldn't read the paper, but he saw that picture. Oh man, he got excited.
Yeah.
And I said, okay, sure enough, he opens up his little travel suitcase, and out comes the toweling, out come these two footprints, and guess what? They're dead ringers for this.
Really?
Right down to the exact orientation and position of the pressure ridge. So the same species. I mean, that's why I'm convinced that the Chinese Yeren is the representation of the population of origin of Sasquatch that then emigrated to North America. Or when you say emigrated, extended its range as available habitat presented itself into North America.
So I keep threatening to talk about skepticism, but then I keep I keep finding all these things that are like just way more fun to talk about.
Yeah.
So part of the crux of your views surrounding Sasquatch and other relict hominids is that, God, you got to forgive me, man. If ethnic taxonomy.
Ichno.
I was going to say ethno-tax. I was like, I know that's not right.
ICHNO.
Ichno.
Yeah.
Ichno-taxonomy. And you're just seeing these similarities in between a far-ranging set of examples that have characteristics that you, as a bipedal hominid expert and an anthropologist, would be just absolutely stunned if, in essentially vacuums, right? In these wide-ranging examples that are not related, not from the same area.
Yeah.
You would be stunned to find that just coincidentally, they happen to have these unique features that, namely, like, this like pressure ridge and what it tells you about the gate. It would stun you that if independently, by some matter of coincidence, each one of those had that very telltale sign. Exactly. And because of that, you just simply can't be like, it's convinced you.
Yeah. I mean, you hit the nail on the head. I mean, who is the revelation of the crew cast with a pressure ridge that was unheard of or unnoticed, unknown.
Well, that's interesting to think about, because I want to hear the rest of it, but I was curious specifically in 1967 when those were cast.
Yeah.
Were there people who could identify like that feature as being like, a thing? Like how, I would assume now there's many more people that would like identify that feature.
Yes. Yeah, because the interest in, I must say I was kind of in a vanguard of graduate students that were taking particular interest in hominin bipedalism, mm-hmm. in part because of the impact, as I mentioned, of this burgeoning of the hominid fossil record.
Mm-hmm.
Prior to that, there were fewer individuals who were sufficiently versed in those aspects that they would have recognized. And even today, even now, the people attempt. The famous Laetoli tracks of East Africa that Mary Leakey discovered, that have been at least tentatively attributed to Lucy's type, show a pressure ridge, but not all recognize that as for what it is. And I've made the case very strongly. The accumulation of evidence and of published studies and so forth, not just on the footprints, but on the foot skeletons of these early hominins, have now finally acknowledged that these hominins walked on flat, flexible feet with a non-divergent big toe. See, that struck them as having a weird combination. Why would you lose divergence of the big toe unless to incorporate it into an arch?
Oh, I see.
See, and my argument was, no, you're getting the cart before the horse. Why would you keep a divergent big toe in a bipedal terrestrial hominin that doesn't climb around in the trees for its resources anymore?
Yeah.
Because that's a feature that appears late in development. When you look in utero, the fetal development of an early fetal chimpanzee, its foot looks much more like a human than it does once it's born.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah.
So it would stand to reason that if you were going to make an evolutionary jump to being bipedal, right, the first thing that you're going to do is you're going to get that big toe in a more efficient place.
Yeah. Yeah. That's the idea. And in fact, some apes that walk facultatively bipedal, that means they can walk bipedally, although they're not well adapted. They will line up their big toe with the direction of travel, because that works the best for the ankle and the midfoot joints. And then they end up supinating their foot into a position where the lateral digits are lined up. But there's still some idiosyncrasy, so it's not a real strong tendency. But to your original point, all of these things started to correlate together, and it begs the question then, what was the inspiration for if these were hoaxed to include a feature? And some have argued, oh, well, it's just a byproduct of walking on a flexible artificial foot. Well, there was one fellow, and now his name just for the moment slips my mind. It'll pop back in. Crowley.
Okay.
Crowley, who made some artificial feet out of latex rubber, strapped him to his feet, his shoes, and then he went walking on the beach, took pictures. All you have to do is juxtapose examples, and his so-called his pressure ridge that just results from the flexibility, the random flexibility of this foot, this fake foot, moves all over the place because it's not constrained by an underlying skeleton. It's just an artifact of a flexible foot.
Right. And
depending on how his foot shifts in relationship or whatever, his pressure ridge, yes, there's a pressure ridge, but it's never in the same place twice. Whereas these are remarkably consistent because they're constrained by the underlying skeleton. There's two bones in this transverse tarsal joint, the talonavicular. The talus is the ankle bone, and then the bone directly in front of it, and the cuboid and calcaneus. The calcaneus is the heel bone. So, the ankle bone and the heel bone, those have common names. They're a little more familiar, but the bones directly in front of those two, which end up defining what we call a medial and lateral column of the foot, those two bones are what provide the flexion and rotation of the forefoot relative to the hindfoot that in an ape allow them to climb up trees, and then when they're on the ground, they can still provide leverage through the heel. But see, when you're climbing up a tree, the reason to have that flexibility, when you're climbing up the tree, your foot has a dual function. The forefoot is prehensile. It grabs, and the hindfoot is propulsive. It's the lever, with the fulcrum not up at the ball of the foot, but at the midfoot where the foot has that foot. So it can lever while still maintaining a grip. Unlike us, what are our options? If you've ever watched a Hawaiian shinny up a palm tree, you have to put your feet, like a duck.
Yeah, you have to kind of like spread them.
Yeah. None of them tries to spread their big toes really to wrap around but all that has to do with the foot. So when the foot comes to the ground, it still has that midfoot flexibility. Even if the toe is no longer divergent, there are actually advantages to keeping that. And hominins walked on flat, flexible feet for a long, long time. For the Sasquatch, what an elegant adaptation that lets it walk up steep slopes, with a lot of toe length for prehension, but then it can have that flexible instep
to get its weight just kind of over.
Right, yeah. Right. I mean, the mental image to think of is you go off trail, you're hiking up a hillside, and so it's you almost have to resort to like a mountaineer with crampons going up a glacier. You stick your toes in because you can't bend your foot, and then especially if it's constrained by, the modern hiking shoes are much different than in years past when you used to wear.
But you can't get the right leverage.
Right. So what you end up either turning and walking like a
side
duck,
hill,
or you switch back, just cut trail switchbacking back and forth, so that you're and then you're just dealing with the pronation supination aspects of it. But this creature has a foot that allows it to walk right up those hillsides with remarkably improved efficiency over a human. So it's a tremendous adaptation for the habitat they're reportedly existing in.
So again, in many contexts, all kind of independent of each other.
Yeah.
You as an anthropologist and bipedal anatomical evolutionary researcher, you've just seen too many features stacked up on top of each other.
Yeah.
That you're like, dude, okay, either this is my immediate peers messing with me, or this has to be, the thing. And obviously you don't really think your immediate peers are messing with you. It would be too fantastic to be true.
Yeah.
So you alluded that, or you didn't allude, you said it earlier in our conversation. You have seen potentially a glimpse of one of these creatures. Was that on that same 1996 trip?
No. It was much more recently, just a couple of 2 or 3 years ago now. I'd have to look at the calendar again. I was in Alberta, Canada, at the invitation of a local investigator there out of Calgary. And one of his study sites was a site called Nordegg, which if you just go west from Calgary, almost due west, as far as you can go until you run into the Rocky Mountains, it's right there, just north of the Jasper Mountains. Beautiful, beautiful country. And a lot of it is restricted access, so no motorized. Well, you can take motorized vehicles, but not regular vehicles.
Sure.
You can go in four-wheelers or the amphibious. He had a 8-wheel amphibious
vehicle.
Argo. An Argo, yes. And man, we could tool around because there were a lot of boggy areas, and we could go across the river. And anyway, we were camped up against the berm, closing the road that we accessed the area with. That road continued through a little gulch and then up the other side and continued on. A secondary road with a good developed gravel bed. We would make a habit. Our routine was basically hike all day long. So we were putting in 10, 12 miles a day, just hiking around, exploring, looking for sign, going off trail and so forth, and finding footprints, 13.5, 14-inch tracks of something that was so heavy that compared to our footprints, which on this, much of the understory was moss, and it was like memory foam for us. We'd walk across it and you'd turn around, look, and you could just watch your footprints disappear. But this was heavy enough that it compressed that moss to the point it didn't rebound.
What do folks estimate the average size and weight of a Sasquatch? Maybe.
Well, I think Patty may represent a kind of typical female, and her height, it comes in just under 7 foot, so between 6'8", 7 foot, and weighs in excess of 700 pounds. I'm pretty confident in that. Not from, the impression of the prints on that firm sand are impressive, to make a pun there, but more to the point, we have in the foot length in the casts a scale, and can estimate those dimensions of the figure on the film. And we can see her figure almost, 180 degrees. And so we can estimate proportions pretty good, pretty well. Using that, I modeled her as just a simple series of cylinders.
Yeah.
So each body segment is a cylinder. And that's fair even for the torso, because she's as deep from front to back as she is from side to side. And so it's spitballing a little bit, but I think you're well in the ballpark. Yeah.
What about for a male?
Well, then a male is on average, the tracks range from 16, 17. The biggest I have that I'm confident in is 19 inches in length. And they typically are much wider for the length, much wider through the forefoot and especially through the heel. So I would put that at between 12 and 1,300 pounds. So it's like a moose, it's like,
oh yeah,
this is a Pleistocene megafauna.
Yeah.
It really is. These are big, but they're,
So,
but the point is that there are other animals out there that are of that dimension that can survive. I mean, it's not like,
it's not totally singular.
Yeah, we're not. Yeah, and we're not talking about a 15-foot tall giant, that towers above the canopy and stomping through the forest.
Yeah,
this is a creature that actually, their size. I mean, I've often been impressed in some of the habitats I've been in, where you're navigating deadfall and so forth. That size is actually a better adapted size to the texture of the habitat than our size is. We're kind of at a loss sometimes, especially when I was in the redwoods forest of Northern California. Those deadfalls, I mean, they provide or produce an imposing obstacle when the tree trunk is 8 feet thick,
just anywhere where you
diameter.
Get that matchstick, burn area. So you're in Alberta, you find these footprints left by a very heavy animal.
Right. And so then the flip side of that strategy, after making our presence clearly known by hiking and examining things and riding around even further reach with the vehicles, and we had a drone. He had a big multi-copter drone, so we could explore up and down the river course, which is really nice, and see the sandbar. We could actually identify and see some wildlife footprints from the drone. Then we would stay up late at night. We had a fire pit, a culvert that was turned on its end, and we would routinely stay up quite late in hopes that our activity, our conversation, cooking over the fire would attract attention as well. And sure enough, on about the fifth night, something approached camp. We were first alerted by these whistling calls. They were kind of avian. I've not heard a bird call at night. I mean, there are some birds that do sound off at night, and some owls, but this was accompanying the sound of the moose that we mentioned, stomping through the undergrowth and the deadfall and leaf litter and so forth. It was big, and there were the sound of branches cracking, whether it was simply stepping on things or whether it was intentionally cracking things to intimidate us. It wasn't clear, but in one instance, it was quite suggestive of that. There was a member of our group who fancied herself something of an animal whisperer, I'll say. She didn't claim to be psychic or anything unusual, but just had a real knack with animals. And so she was also very gutsy. She gets up and walks beyond the firelight into the darkness towards where the sounds are coming, talking reassuringly and getting, there were no vocalizations of interaction, but it was clearly moving around and agitated. And then it broke a branch or something. It sounded like cracking a baseball bat against a tree trunk. And I'm watching through night vision monocular without the benefit of recording capability, unfortunately. But I could actually see her and this crack, and her legs started to shake, her knees started to shake. At that point, I mean, whether there was any other influence, I mean, we've talked about the possibility of the production of infrasound and the effects, the physiological effects that can have on you. she retreated back to the campfire. And right at that point, I shifted my position because of the smoke. Had a better vantage down where these sounds were coming from. And something broke from the shadows as seen through night vision and went up the slope, across the road, and into the shadows on the other side. So if you've seen the Patterson-Gimlin film, if you imagine that classic strip of Patty when she goes behind the debris, because the berm, in a similar fashion, this berm catching the firelight was obscuring what I was seeing right up to about mid-thigh. But the rest of the outline, it was just silhouette against because there was no moon up, just starlight and the light-colored gravel of the roadbed, and kind of illuminating her, backlighting her, or it. Patty would be her, but it. And but that I could see the low set head on broad shoulders and thick torso. I could see an arm move, and and it was like it was gliding, that smooth, compliant gait, and then it was gone.
How long was this encounter? Oh,
just moments. I mean, if you imagine what would be the equivalent of maybe 8 steps when it emerged, and then it wasn't bouncing though. I mean, it was just gliding, which gave me pause, because I'm looking and I don't want to read into, am I just seeing some shadow from some effect of the night vision? I'm sitting there looking and I almost didn't say anything because I didn't want it to be overinterpreted. But on the other hand, I wanted them to check out because I knew I had to leave the next morning before sunup. And I said, you guys have got to look for footprints, which they did. And Todd video documented the whole process where they, it was hard ground in this case where it was exposed, where it wasn't under the tree cover, hard ground, weeds and branches and so forth. But they cut the sign. They being Todd and John Bindernagel and this other woman, Sonia, that was there. Broken twigs, disturbed soil, and stones overturned and so forth. And boom, here's the steps. They ran the tape, and I'm watching the video of this process, and I'm thinking, no, because I thought it was on the other side of this little ravine, given its size. I thought it was just behind the berm. It wasn't. It was on the opposite bank, but it was so big, standing probably 7.5 feet tall, when Todd filmed Dr. John Bindernagel, he stood where I had been, filmed Bindernagel walk the tape line, the penny dropped. And I go, oh, I mean, that's right. That's where it was. That's exactly what it looked like, except what I saw was another 1.5 feet taller than John. And they found more footprints under the, in the moss. They were able to track it for like a mile before they lost its sign. And so, good chance that it was indeed. I mean, I can't imagine anyone up there to prank us. Extremely remote. There's only one approach on that road. We were armed. Even though it was Canada, we were armed, had a license to carry a shotgun because bears and cougar are an issue, especially the bears. But, I just don't imagine anyone going to the trouble. I mean, why would, I guess, you could argue, oh, well, Todd arranged it. This was one of Todd's cohort that came up and.
We were mentioning that you get asked about Todd a lot.
Yeah.
And I was like, we don't need to touch on it. I mean, not that you were opposed to it. You just mentioned that we like to have these interviews where they're a little bit less the same sort of questions.
Right.
So we kind of go over stuff.
Sure.
Like, something you get asked a bunch.
Right.
But in qualifying and talking about this story, you should mention who Todd is.
Sure. And Todd Standing is a personality, an individual, an investigator who resides in Calgary, Alberta, has gained some notoriety for his activities because he gets out. He's been, he's a bit obsessive compulsive when it comes to this subject, And so he gets out there in the field much more than a lot of people. And there was no question after spending 5 days with him, he's tall, he's athletic, he gets out there. He walked me into the ground, and I was patting myself on the shoulder that I could keep up with him back then. I was feeling bad for Dr. Bindernagel, who was about 8 years my senior, and but he still was quite spry at that time as well. So Todd has gained some,
he's like a semi-infamous character, not like infamy in necessarily a bad way, but people have a lot of feelings.
Notorious is a good way to describe it. For good and bad. I mean, there are people who think that the things that he's done and the things that he has presented are fabulous and fascinating, and there's others who are absolutely convinced that he's a hoaxer and prankster and just carpet bagging, so to speak. And, I don't begrudge someone trying to monetize and turn a profit on their activities in order to sustain their ability to pursue their interests.
Bro, that is exactly what I'm doing now.
Yeah. And he certainly isn't getting rich doing what he's doing. It's not a gold mine.
If somebody just wanted to be rich and famous, I'll tell you what, they'd probably find a more personally interesting audience being a musician or or an actor, it would be a weird level of fame to aspire to.
Well, sure, it's a fairly narrow audience. I mean, unless you grab that brass ring, you're the one that brings in the specimen, and even then, it's not. Well, I mean, book deals and movie deals and things like that, I guess, that spin off from that kind of accomplishment or exposure. The fallout, but it's going to have a lot of fallout, negative and positive, as well as positive. The negative fallout, dealing with that, if you are the first person to shoot a Sasquatch, you can imagine it's going to be quite a controversial topic.
Yeah. So that's who you're out there with. So some of these people who might be skeptical of your experience suggest that, it was Todd kind of
contriving, salting the mind, who knows?
Yeah.
And my attitude is, at this point is, hey, let the chips. I'm not making claims. I'm not putting that in the forefront. For me, when I'm asked what's the most compelling evidence, it's the footprints.
It sounds like you're viewing your experience with a healthy dose of skepticism. I think this is what I saw, but it could have been.
I could be wrong. Yeah,
could have been a bunch of other things. So it sounds like you do a fair amount of field research. I'd be interested to know, because there's the History Channel esque, and I'm not trying to dog on History Channel, right? But there's that kind of B movie type of field research that people who are into cryptozoology or paranormal stuff. I didn't know the cryptozoology was kind of pejorative.
Well, it depends. It depends on your audience.
Yeah.
Because
it's synonymous with pseudoscience.
Well, in some circles.
Yeah.
Yeah, in some circles. That's the problem. Its inception and the motivation of Bernard Heuvelman that created or coined the term. He was just trying to draw attention to persistent evidence or claims of species as yet unrecognized by science. So, others say, well, you don't need a separate discipline. There is exploratory zoology, but and so by creating this nomen, you're actually stigmatizing it.
What does it mean? What is the etymology of crypto?
Oh, crypto just means hidden animals, the search for hidden animals. hidden in that they're rare and elusive in location or in time. They're out of place in location or time in a way.
So like the Loch Ness Monster being an example, like a plesiosaur or whatever.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay.
So those are, and that's the problem is that the poster child or the poster examples of cryptids, as the term has been coined, are these monsters, and in the traditional definition of monsters, which originally
something born of fantasy.
Yeah, or a marvel, something that's singular, that's unusual, it's atypical. Whereas, really we're looking at just not unusual, other than the fact that we haven't recognized them if they exist. But otherwise, it's mainstream zoology, and so that's why it's become. I actually wrote a paper with Dr. Bindernagel. He was the senior author, and he invited me on, where he explores the disservice to the subject of Sasquatch research that the label of cryptozoology has given or has burdened it with, and for many of those very reasons, it just gets lumped in with pseudoscience. And yet, when you press the skeptics who make that charge, this is just pseudoscience. What Meldrum does is just pseudoscience. When you press them to justify that statement, has he published and had his work peer reviewed, or he doesn't present at the mainstream meetings? Well, yes. Tick off the yes box to every one of those things to a limited degree, limited by the bias against the topic by people usually who are quite ignorant of the evidence.
Well, yeah, I mean, you can't participate in those things unless like the people who govern those things allow you to participate.
Yeah, and there are gatekeepers for sure. Just whether I can get an abstract accepted to present at the physical anthropology meetings has been a 50-50 proposition. And so the times that I've successfully, and it comes down to the luck of the roll of the dice as to who reviews the submitted abstract, and sometimes it gets in and it's well received. It's received with interest and curiosity and a lot of enthusiasm by people who listen or who read my poster. I found that it's funny because, sometimes there's this stigma that a podium presentation is a little more prestigious than a poster presentation. But when I would present on this topic in its various iterations from the podium, I would, always be sure to leave, because I want to engage. I would leave time for Q&A, and it was crickets because no one dared ask a question.
Themselves.
Yeah. But if I do a poster, it's 4 hours straight of dynamic interaction, because then they can come and talk to you one-on-one. And although there was this one case where I always have a little miniaturized version of my poster, on a single sheet of paper, and had a manila envelope full of these, like 200 or so, and they'll be gone. But it's simply thumbtacked to the board at the bottom. And there was this fellow, I had gone for a break, and it was leaning up against the wall when I came back just to rest for a minute after hours and hours of talking. And he's sitting there reading it, and he's looking. And then he sees the envelope. And before he reaches, he looks in both directions. And then he quickly reaches and sticks it in his back. He was embarrassed to take a copy of the poster and had to check to make sure that there was no one looking over. The
coast was clear.
Yeah, if the coast was clear. I just sat there back there laughing, thinking, "Oh my gosh,
man! If you're curious, take it."
But it was so well. And then someone actually said what wasn't spoken. He's in there in front of my poster, and I'm having this lively conversation, and some of it's positive, and some of it's detracting, and I'm sparring. And then he sidles up next to me. I didn't know the individual. He was not familiar to me, probably not in physical anthropology per se, but one of the other disciplines. Anyway, he leans up to me, leans over, and he goes, I'm so glad to see somebody tackling this. I'm glad it's not me, but I'm glad to see someone doing it. Good work. Keep at it.
Well, that's like kind of like an interesting thing. And I do want to get on to like what field research entails, because there are some pretty interesting ways that you calculate things like population density. Right. There are interesting ways beyond tracks that you establish an idea of whether, one of these creatures is in the area.
Right.
The guy said that he was happy that somebody was doing it.
Yeah.
But he was also happy that it wasn't him.
Yeah.
And the implication there is like, hey, I'm interested in this, but I feel like if I were to undertake it as a professional, it could have implications, beyond like just this immediate thing. Like, if somebody wants to chalk off this immediate thing, that's up to them.
Right.
But it can have implications to people chalking off more of your thoughts on fields of study that they might consider like more legitimate. Right. Mm-hmm. Like, how do you, like, how what is your philosophy in that trade-off? Because it's on some level, it's got to be damaging in the eyes of some folks to your reputation as an academic.
Oh yeah. Oh, most definitely. Well, and early on, this was, and I was careful to kind of keep it as somewhat compartmentalized and limited in the amount of time and attention that I devoted to it. And I saw it as a very legitimate facet of my overall research program, because, I mean, the possibility of another bipedal hominin existing that we could compare and contrast the human condition to, what a fascinating prospect, what a fascinating opportunity. As time progressed and I became sort of the go-to guy, because there were others. I mean, I've mentioned Dr. Bindernagel, he's passed. Dr. Krantz, no sooner did he retire than he passed from cancer. Dr. Dara Swindler, a famous primate anatomist at the University of Washington, who had kind of his fingers in this, but kept it very close to the vest until he retired. And then he passed. I mean, this has been the story, is that the very few individuals who have taken a more open position usually have postponed that, have put that off until
they're going to make it a retirement project.
Exactly. And then they don't stick around long enough. So I like to say idealistic rather than naive. I think there was a little bit of naivete, but I was idealistic enough to jump into the deep end of the pool even before I had tenure. And as I mentioned, it nearly cost me my job. So that
how was that?
Oh, it split my department in two, very evenly. And then it fell down to the committee, and then the chair recommendation to the dean for my promotion to associate professor and tenure. And at the time, my chair was very antagonistic towards this topic, and some in the department were very antagonistic. It saw me as a bane, was an embarrassment to the university. And I had one of my past chairs. The only thing he ever said to me directly about this topic was, and I'll give you a verbatim quote, "It chaps my ass every time I go to the mammal meetings and someone walks up to me and asks, 'How's the Bigfoot guy?'" And I go, "Well," I said, "you must have," I'm thinking to myself, I didn't say this.
"You must have a pretty chapped ass."
Yeah, you must have a pretty chapped ass, a pretty thin skin back there. You might want to do something about that, or find out, well, why are your friends very interested in what I'm doing? It's like I had one of my nemesis, if you will, detractors, antagonists in another department, who I was his favorite punching bag, but in one, he wrote a column in the local paper and other opportunities to poke at me, but talking about how
he wrote a column in the newspaper.
Oh, he was
talking shit.
He was a regular columnist.
Okay.
But I was a frequent topic. And then I became sort of the meme for anything crazy or loony. He would refer to Dr. Meldrum, and his Bigfoot studies. And one year, I guess it was a slow week, but it was Easter. And so the title of his column was Bigfoot and the Easter Bunny. And basically after ragging on me, his thesis was I would be as justified as an academic pursuing the existence of the Easter Bunny as investigating the existence of Bigfoot. And then in the wake of that, he was in the physics department. He was an instructor in the physics department. Someone in the physics department brought in one of those Bigfoot lawn ornaments, and they put an Easter basket full of plastic colored eggs hanging there. And that adorned the physics department office for probably about 2 or 3 years. It
seems childish.
It does. That's what I was going to say. It's sophomoric. I was going to give him even the benefit of sophomoric, but childish is more adequate. But they would bemoan the fact that I was such a.
Why do you think that they do that? I guess what I'm asking is, it's like. The obvious answer is it's a product of them being assholes.
Yes, I was going to say a little more tactfully.
We're pretty blunt here, man.
Character flaw, but that's describing.
You should hear some of the other recordings, dude.
It's like is your responsibilities, your activities are not enough to keep you occupied. You have to stick your nose in every.
Well, I mean, is it like a? Because some of the things that you hear about this in particular, right, is that when theories are put forth into like the scientific realm, right?
Yeah. The
idea is that the burden of proof is on the person positing the theory.
Sure.
To be like, this, I think that this exists, and like, here is the evidence that is like leading me to that conclusion. Right. And I feel like with animals in particular, and I don't know. I'm paraphrasing something that I kind of had no business reading, to be honest with you. The idea is that you would need something like pretty darn tangible, like, like hair or a carcass or a photograph or something like that.
Yeah.
What they don't like folks to do is say, I think this thing exists and you can't tell me that it doesn't, because that puts the burden of disproof onto your peer group or whatever. Is that like kind of like the crux of like a lot of these like objections to this kind of study?
Well, I think it.
First off, do I have that right?
Yeah, pretty much. Could you explain it better than I just did?
Well,
no. I think you got it. The norms, the tradition, the convention is that a novel species is demonstrated by physical remains. Something that is diagnostic. It ultimately, in order to establish a type. I mean, it's one thing you come in with a hide or something, but the hide itself, if it's just a cutout hide, unless there's more information like DNA or a microscopic analysis of the hair or whatever, you need something physical, something that's diagnostic, that differentiates it from other animals. So, a jaw with teeth, part of a skull. Other parts of the postcrania are less differentiating. The subtleties. I mean, sometimes you have different species, say, within a genus of a rodent, and on the basis of the skeleton, you couldn't differentiate one from the other. But the teeth or the skull dimensions and so forth, it can be really subtle. I mean, because when we're talking about a biological species, the thing that separates them into species is their inability to form viable offspring, right? So it's just genetics.
And it's funny too, because you see this, we were talking to Jack Horner, and like, a big thing that we were talking about is the reclassification of species that were previously described but were in fact found to likely be the juvenile species of an already long since described, thing.
Yeah, it's more challenging with fossils, where you're dealing with skeletal remains, and that's the point. Is you go into these museums, you pull the drawers out, skeletons may look remarkably the same. It's very similar, but you look at the pelage, the skin, and the coloration is dramatically different. These are the way species recognize each other and the way they maintain barriers between hybridization crosses. Anyway, so you needed something physical. So in the absence of that, see, I've never argued that science should recognize the existence of Sasquatch. I've simply argued science should recognize the legitimacy of pursuing the question of the existence of Sasquatch. You look at the cover of my book, and it has an endorsement from Jane Goodall, the foreword's written by George Schaller, a preeminent naturalist. He doesn't endorse the existence of Sasquatch, but he endorses enthusiastically my pursuit, the justification of my pursuit of the question, positing this question based on the evidence that I have.
He's rewarding like a courageous level of curiosity at potential personal expense.
Yeah. Both his and mine. Right. And there has been, there is fallout in his direction as well for acknowledging, although, in his position with his reputation and career.
But do you think do you think this like altruistic version of like study is what people are trying to defend in like bringing you down?
Well, no, I think the effort to bring it down is again, it's multifaceted, but one of the facets is given the stigma that is attached to this. And when you look at the history, when you look at the temporal trajectory back in the 60s, the notion of these things existing, when Ivan Sanderson, who was I'm not sure what to call him. He wasn't a PhD, but he had lots of accolades, lots of initials behind his name, lots of different recognitions and memberships and honors and so forth. He was, when it came to the school of hard knocks, I mean, he was a naturalist, but he also had a very active curiosity about not only topics relating to kind of cryptozoology, but all sorts of different strange things. But and that didn't help the perception, obviously. But he was one of the pioneers. His book on Abominable Snowman, Legend Come to Life, Subhuman Species on 5 Continents was the subtitle. A tome, an encyclopedic tome, where from his world travels, he collected all of these amazing narratives and evidence. I mean, he's got an appendix. It was all the different footprint reports attributed to these. He called them ABSMs, was his acronym. Abominable Snowmen, ABSM. Anyway, but the point was, he published his book in 1962, right at the height of this single species hypothesis. There can be only one. We're it. And so these others couldn't exist. So you look at the reviews of his book, and it was treated like a work of fiction, fantasy. And so that as a result, the science pulled back, and into that void comes all of the adventurers, the fortune seekers, and the charlatans, unfortunately. Sure. And that has been largely the case. And so there was an entire generation kind of tainted by that, a generation of academics tainted by that. So we see scientists, young generation of scientists coming up, and I've had opportunities to visit with some of these on occasions, various circumstances, and they're fascinated. But I tell them, you've got to be careful. You've got to play it close to the vest until you have tenure. Yeah. You cultivate your skills. If you're interested in this, say, and you have predilection to molecular biology. Get yourself in a position that once you're able, you can do the definitive genetic study on potential samples, or, whether it's bioacoustics, get yourself in a position where then once you have tenure, then you can turn your expertise and your reputation to that problem and really figure out what's making these inexplicable noises, vocalizations. Anyway, it's happening. That's happening. So because of that, of the spillover of that phenomenon has been that it's very stigmatized. It's tabloid. It's pseudoscience, right? And, when you go to find a book about Bigfoot, it's not in the natural history section. It's in the New Age, or not the New Age. It's in the unusual knowledge, unorthodox knowledge. When my book was taken on by Barnes and Noble to be carried as a regular offering, I would occasionally go into a Barnes and Noble and look. And when the book was printed, I was very adamant that, they put the little categorization. I want it to be natural science, And so I'll go and look, and my book was over between Bermuda Triangle and crop circles.
And would you go move it?
Well, sometimes I would. Or if there was more than one copy, I would put one over it. But I went up to the manager one time and I go, hey, why is it over here? It's supposed to be right there next to Jane Goodall's books about chimpanzees. Oh, well, you'll get 10 times the traffic over here in the New Age section.
Really?
That's what she said. And I go, well, that's not the point. I said, okay, keep one there, but put one over there with Jane Goodall so that people who are looking at those kinds of books will see it and recognize that this is about a primate.
It's an academic pursuit. It's not like a work of fan fiction.
Yeah, and I'm not to besmirch there's probably very bona fide objective investigations of crop circles and Bermuda Triangle.
That happens all the time, man.
Yeah. So that's been the problem, is that there's the stigma, and there's this notion that it reflects negatively, this reaction of the department chairman to being chided about the Bigfoot guy, and yet there's so many people who they know of Idaho State University only because of moi, and there are some that recognize that. Yeah. So the director of communications and public relations, who's a good friend of mine, that's his attitude. Anything that you do on this topic, we'll cover. Because I was on the Today Show. I've been on National Geographic Channel. I've had some national exposure.
Oh, now that I talk about History Channel, I'm worried.
Well, yeah, and all the documentaries and everything, I've always tried to put a very positive foot forward. I've tried to represent it.
Would you say you put a big foot forward?
Yeah, big. I've made a big impression on the field.
I had to, man.
Yeah, I know.
Okay, hey, we're going to take a real quick break. When we come back, we are going to get to the field research, and we're going to get to the skepticism, and we're just going to talk more fun things about Sasquatch, man. I love this. This is a great conversation. Hey guys, this is Ad Hayden coming to you, or I guess semi-Ad Hayden. We had a whole bunch of ad copy written up, but I don't think I need it for this product. I just want to tell you about something that I like genuinely. That's sharedpour.com. Sharedpour.com is the place to go, in my humble opinion, if you're looking for hard-to-find bourbons, allocated whiskeys. I know that those two are sometimes the same thing. Or just spirits in general. I've been using them since way before we even considered being partners with them. Actually, since before, Andrew, I think, when did we start recording episodes for this? Yeah, like since before we recorded the first episode of Backcountry Manifesto. And here's the receipts to prove it. You see this bottle of Mammoth from our bourbon? That's a single barrel select right there. Now check this out. Here, you can hear it too if you're listening. Right, is that gonna be in frame, Andrew? Okay, well right here, I don't know. There's my receipt from March of 2024. I really do use these people. I believe in them as a company. They're great folks. Now, if you're 21 or older, that is very important. If you're a minor, pay no attention to this advertisement. And you live in the United States, sharedpour.com will ship liquor straight to your doorstep. You'll need a signature. But they'll do it with flat rate shipping, which is really helpful if you're ordering a couple bottles. That way you don't pay out the nose through shipping. You could order like 10, 15 bottles. I don't know, maybe Craig, don't get mad at me. And they will ship for the same price as one. The other thing is that they're customer service experts. If you call them, should you have a problem with your order, and you won't, you will get a person who actually works there answering the phone and making the issue right. They have the best selection, whether it's a single barrel pick, again, a hard to find allocated bourbon, or even your daily sipper. You should check out sharedport.com. And right now, and that is ad speak, you can use code Backcountry, okay? That's Backcountry, all one word, all caps. I think that's important. That's what they were texting me and telling me was important. You will get 10% off your entire purchase at sharedport.com. Go check them out. You'll like them as much as I do. You'll get a bunch of cool whiskey. You'll impress your friends. You'll annoy your spouse. And you'll have some great spirits. Backcountry for 10% off your order at sharedport.com. Before we took that break, we were talking about people who are skeptical to the point maybe just like being contrarian or just shitty.
Right.
There are like legitimate skeptics, and I'm like, myself, I am very open to a lot of things. I'm not sure how open I am to like the idea, because I spend a ton of time like in really, really, really wild places.
Mm-hmm.
You know, everywhere from like coastal Alaska to
Mm-hmm.
like, I spent a lot of time in the Frank Church,
Mm-hmm.
Areas like that.
Mm-hmm.
And I've seen all sorts of things that are rare, you know.
Right.
It is surprising. It would be really surprising to me personally to like have somebody be like, yeah, somebody hit one with a car in Washington and Bigfoot is for sure real. So I tend to lean skeptic. I don't have really hard feelings about it, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you know, this has not been a gotcha type interview.
No.
I'm really, really enjoying like the conversation we're having.
Mm-hmm.
People who are skeptics from a reasonable perspective, what are some of the main arguments?
Right. Well, and it's interesting. You described your own position, which you are certainly not alone in. And
but I'm also recognizing that my own position is like based on something very anecdotal.
Sure.
You know, I also haven't seen a polar bear, but I'm not like, I don't know if polar bears exist.
There you
right?
go. Well, right, exactly, and that's one of the points. But you actually used the word that is very critical here, and that was the rareness of some of these phenomena, these organisms out there, and so forth. And you've mentioned that you've encountered a lot of those rare things, but probably not all of them. Mm-hmm. You know, and as you said, that many of our experiences are nothing more than anecdotal acknowledgments for the time being. And I think that's a really important element. One of the things that I stress is that the people, they hear about all these reports, they hear about all this activity, they see these graphics that have the continent blanketed with push pins, of all the different things that have happened. When you look at those closely, a lot of those are bumps in the night. Someone has a weird feeling or hears a sound they can't identify, and there's too much that's attributed, undiscriminatorily to Sasquatch. Now, the times we have examples like this are rare, and in fact, most of the credible reported encounters, happen purely by happenstance. So I think these creatures are remarkably rare, and that so. An apologetic explanation. I can't tell you how many times I have talked with an avid outdoorsman who has lots of experience hunting all over the place. And, for example, one of my past department chairs was very negative, very I guess, chagrined, resentful of my embarking down this path. And one of his retorts was, I was born and raised in Idaho. I've lived here all my life. I've hunted and fished all across the state. If this was out there, I would have seen it by now, which I thought was quite an arrogant attitude to begin with. But then I've also heard people say, I was born and raised in Idaho. I've hunted and fished all across the state.
Ignore what I'm about to do here, man. There you go.
Here we go. Yeah. I've hunted and fished across the state. I've never seen a Sasquatch until last month. You'll never guess what happened. I was, and then he'll give the story of his encounter or finding undeniable footprints in a remote area.
Yeah, well,
it's that one experience, and suddenly he's 180 degrees. So, like I said, I'm not here to reap converts or to proselytize, but I'm just laying out the evidence, which I think, as a scientist, I have an obligation to do. So,
I'll tell you one thing that I know for sure. I do a lot of archery hunting.
Yep,
and every September, there is no evidence there are bull elk in the woods. And then one day I was like, yep, there's one, it happens all at once. Right. It's actually that's a piece of advice that I give, new hunters in general, which is just like, hey man, it doesn't happen until it happens. And then it happens all at once.
Exactly.
But
yeah,
it's the same reason that you have people whose minds are blown by the amount of bears in like a place like New Jersey, for instance.
Yeah.
And interestingly, that leads into something else that I want to ask you about. One of my favorite things that you've told me in a previous conversation, but, they assume that because they don't see them, therefore they don't exist, and they don't realize that New Jersey has damn near close to. I'd like to know, Andrew. I think like 20,000, like an estimated population. I think Pennsylvania had like 19,000 bears.
It could be that high. Maine has 35,000.
Do you know Maine's the only place you can trap a bear legally?
Oh, is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Oh,
they do it with power snares.
Yeah, they've got most. There's only a couple states. Wyoming doesn't have statistics on bear population published. Was the only state around it. Idaho has 35,000. Were you leading to, did I give a ratio?
Yeah. It's one of my favorite things, but I want to get to the skepticism because I want to bring that into field work.
Okay, yes.
So another thing that you had told me, and this was right before we started rolling again, you were telling me a story where I asked you if people ever like accosted you, like, trying to do like gotcha journalism or trying to like, embarrass you in like a public, again, we were because we were riffing off the shitty folks, right?
Sure.
I'll keep classifying like that so you don't have to. You were relaying a story to me about somebody kind of hitting you with the chief point of skepticism, like the kind of crown jewel of the skeptics argument. So I'd like to hear that now, please.
Sure. Well, I was invited to present to a classroom, an anthropology class at the University of Wyoming. And the professor, who was quite sympathetic, I mean, he was skeptical, but very intrigued and sympathetic to the possibilities of the subject. I mean, clearly he was going to the trouble of incorporating this into his curriculum for his students to also weigh and think about objectively. He also arranged for a broader presentation to the campus community and, in fact, the local community at large in the town. And it was quite interesting. The reception was very positive. I presented a diversity of different types of evidence. It focused on the Patterson-Gimlin to an extent, film to an extent, and particularly showcased the footprints and so forth. And then in attendance was the department chairman, and he was a forensic archaeologist. He basically, reconstructed lifeways from the material remains left behind by indigenous peoples. Mm-hmm. And And he asked that question, that number one skeptical question is, where's the bodies? Where's the physical remains? I mean, that's it. Michael Shermer, a famous ideological skeptic, he did a Scientific American column in which the theme was, where's the body? Where's the body? It's like we were joking earlier about where's the beef commercial. It's the same kind of, where's the body? And then he said, but then he went too far. He crossed the line. The science starts once you have a body. Well, that's inane. The science starts once you ask a question. And it's how you pursue the investigation of that question, how you marshal and evaluate and assess evidence that's the science scientific method applied. Anyway, this department chair posed that question at the seminar, and I gave him a response. I mean, I talked about the inferred natural history parameters that might affect the numbers of bodies, the numbers of deaths, that is. How often does a death occur? How much density is there?
This is my brother's birthday. He's calling me.
Well, happy birthday, yeah.
Well, we'll get back too soon, Harrison. Sorry about that, dude.
So, and then the physical parameters, the acidity of the soil, the different conditions in the geology of the region and so forth. And it's admittedly an apologist's answer, because we're still faced with this vexing question: why don't we have a body yet?
What do you mean apologists? I've heard you describe answers as being like overly apologetic, or
apologetics is the marshaling of evidence to provide a response, but shy of a conclusive, definitive resolution.
Give me an example of
you hear the term a lot in religious discussions.
Okay.
Apologists are defending the faith, basically, based on the sort of indirect evidence of spiritualism and faith and scripture, accept canonization of scripture and so forth.
Like when you're having a conversation with somebody, and not that I make any sort of practice of getting to religious conversation, because I think that's a really rude thing to do, to be honest with you. But like when somebody maybe, I've watched things on YouTube where, you have a theological debate between two people.
Yeah.
And one of them says, well, what about this? And then in response, the other guy says, well, of course it's true because it was in the Bible, and the Bible is it's like right. That kind of like self-referential.
Authoritative, yeah.
Yeah, and that's not, again, that is something that I've seen on YouTube. That is not my,
So anyway, it's just a response that offers a rationale, but is less than conclusive.
Right.
And obviously, in this case, it doesn't, apologetics isn't satisfying to everyone. Otherwise, everyone would be persuaded to a particular point of view. So at dinner, I had the opportunity to sit right across from this professor, the department chair, and as the opportunity presented itself, I turned to him. I said, "So I'm just curious, how satisfying was my response to your question?" And he thought there for a moment, and he kind of looked up, and he said, "Actually, not at all satisfying." And I said, my reaction then was, and this is one that I've repeated often, I find it interesting that those who adopt a very skeptical posture often have their favorite piece of missing evidence upon which they rest their entire objection, but to the exclusion, to the ignorance of all the other evidence that has accumulated that is so persuasive in many ways. And he goes, "Oh, well, what evidence are you referring to?" And I go, "I just gave an hour-and-a-half presentation." I said, "Were you," I didn't say this, but I was thinking, "Were you awake?
Right.
Were you listening?" And so I pointed out, well, I just gave a presentation and actually enumerated a lot. I said, from my perspective, it's the footprint evidence first and foremost. Take that, for example. How do you account? Well, he goes, oh, well, I'm not an expert in footprints.
And you said, well, I happen to be.
Yes. And then this time I wasn't just thinking it. I said that. Oh, well, I happen to be. I said, don't you think I deserve the same deference that I would give you if we were discussing a topic of forensic archaeology? Well, yeah, I guess. And I said, well, so based on my expertise, and here's some of the points, and then rehearse some of the things I had said previously in the evening. And it changed the tone, though. I mean, just calling him on that fact, what a lame position to assume, well, I'm not an expert, therefore I don't place any credence. I can't evaluate that evidence.
Yeah.
Well, it's just been laid out for you. Anyway, so that wasn't he wasn't intending to give you to use a gotcha, but if someone is asking a legitimate question, that they have a concern about a type of evidence or an interpretation that they've heard, I'm fine with that. But when it's someone just trying to chide you, to be antagonistic and debate for the sake of debating or for the sake of abusing,
Skepticism's like an interesting thing because there's the was it Dunning-Kruger? Is that what it is? The idea that I don't know. The idea that like the more you actually know,
oh sure,
you realize that
the more questions that arise.
Right.
Not the less you know, but it's like if you look at knowledge as an expanding circle, the circumference, it marks the boundary between known and unknown. With more knowledge, there's more circumference, more things that we...
The thing that like a lot of people do, right, is we've all heard that, the person who knows the least acts like they know the most or like believes that they know the most.
Sure.
Like, and it's something that kind of like jumps off of that is a lot of people who go, okay, well, I'm not that dude. The way that they try to know the most is to just take this like position of being a skeptic because that's at once asserting that they know something by acknowledging that they don't know something.
Well, right. Yeah.
And they say, well, how could you know? And it's like, well, I think it's like a really interesting thing and a really interesting trap that otherwise like very smart people fall into is just kind of like this intellectual comfort of just being totally skeptical because it's not necessarily like it's kind of you can't poke a hole in somebody just being a skeptic.
No, exactly. It's not justifiable to doubt just for the sake of doubting.
Yeah.
They adopt, and this is why I referred to earlier Michael Shermer as an ideological skeptic. Skepticism plays an important role in objectivity and critical thinking. But there are people now, it's become vogue to be skeptical. And they wear it like, I make the facetious comment, they wear it like a, bright red armband.
Well, it's a stance, but they don't have any skin in the game because they're not really saying anything other than like, I'm not sure.
Yeah. If you go to someone's Facebook page, in my book, if you go to someone's Facebook page and they list as one of their interests, like like an academic, skepticism and critical thinking, then it's pejorative, I guess, because it's in my skepticism should be a thread in the tapestry of scientific intellectualism. But as soon as you start pounding on one key on the keyboard, or you hold that one thread and pull it, you're going to spoil the fabric, or you're going to drive everyone nuts by simply pounding on skeptics. It can't be. I doubt it. That's the problem. And the problem, and it's exemplified by these people I've labeled as ideological skeptics who, for example, I mentioned Michael Shermer. He was invited by one of my antagonists to campus.
Mm-hmm.
And it just so happened that we actually did have on campus at the Idaho Museum of Natural History an exhibit of evidence for Sasquatch.
Mm-hmm.
That they kept me out of the loop. They kept me. I wasn't in the steering committee. I wasn't allowed to participate in the pulling off of this because that would be too biased. See, because I supposedly have skin in the game.
Whoa, hold on a second.
Yeah,
They made a whole Bigfoot exhibition and didn't get you involved in it?
Exactly. Only after some protestation did I get to sit in on a couple of the organizing meetings.
Okay.
And they relied super heavily on Carl Sagan's The Demon Haunted World, where he lumps, Bigfoot in with Bermuda Triangle, with psychics, with, all sorts of paranormal phenomenon. And, like, for example, they were going to put up his baloney detection kit. And I said, oh, that's too pejorative. I said, well, how about principles of critical thinking? Oh, yeah, I guess we could do that. I mean, but anyway, the fact that they had it, and see, it wasn't here's a presentation about Bigfoot. It's Bigfoot. How do we know? It was Bigfoot as a test case of epistemology, of examining questions of faith and belief and folklore and fact, and fiction and so forth. And, but yet there was a lot of material out. It was a gatebuster. It was intended to be a 6-month temporary exhibit.
People loved it.
Oh, people loved it. People loved it. People came from England to see the exhibit. They kept it on for an additional year. It was so successful. It had more attendance than any exhibit or function of that museum previously or since.
Did they what they end up choosing for the Carl Sagan incorporation?
Oh, well, I mean, there were quotes from the Demon Haunted World scattered all over on the walls amongst the display cases with the, they did the exhibit incorporated to a large extent materials that had been assembled by a British Columbian investigator, a researcher by the name of Chris Murphy, who's written several really great books on the history of the subject and so forth. Very smart guy. Very talented publisher. And he had put together with the intent of creating a traveling exhibit to educate the public. Well, they took his exhibit but didn't use it wholesale. They cut and pasted and trimmed it and recast it with this much more skeptical bent. But they had Michael Shermer come. So he was going to speak about skepticism in general, but the elephant's in the room. And the fellow who had invited him, who was actually in the philosophy department, he asked me. He said I was going to take him down and show him the exhibit.
But why don't you?
Well, no, he said, would you like to tag along? And so I did. I said, well, sure, yeah, it'd be interesting. And so remember, Shermer has written this stuff like "Where's the Body?" has poo-pooed Bigfoot research, but all this blah blah blah. So I took along with me a copy of Sasquatch Legend Meets Science on the off chance that he was unfamiliar with it.
Yeah.
I mean, you would think anybody who professed to be the skeptical voice vis-a-vis Bigfoot would have researched sufficiently that he would have at least encountered, if not.
Is that how this dude really positions himself? Is this like a big part of his academic branding?
Oh, he has no academic branding. He is the managing editor of the Skeptical Inquirer.
Okay, I understand.
And he writes books. He's written half a dozen books or more on skepticism and skeptical.
I now understand
treatment of topics and so forth. So, but I thought you would think, after poo-pooing Bigfoot and so forth, that he would have done some research, and at the very least, he would have come upon the one book written by an academic.
Yeah, endorsed by Jane Goodall.
Right. So I had it there for him, and I said, so I basically put it like that. I said, on the off chance that you hadn't already encountered my book, in your research of the topic, I brought along a copy. He says, "Oh, you have a book?"
Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh.
So I said, "Yeah, let me autograph it for you, and I'd like to gift this to you." And I autographed it and personalized it,
Yeah, I love it.
and gave it to him. And he's thumbing through it, and he said, "Oh, this looks really good." And I said, "I'm just sitting here thinking, you idiot."
Yeah.
And so it was. I mean, that just shows you they come at it from a position of almost complete ignorance. That is, they have not educated themselves. That doesn't prevent them from holding an opinion on these various topics.
Well, I wish people being educated on topics was a barrier to developing an opinion.
Yeah,
I find myself wishing that a lot. What are some other arguments that you've come across? And I'll give you the one that I am familiar with. Earlier in describing Bigfoot encounters in the immediate aftermath of that the Bluff Creek footprint discovery, you related a story about somebody out there picking berries.
Yeah.
And the Bigfoot.
Yeah.
And what you'd mentioned was that, he was watching this like very ape-like creature eating these berries, and one of the things that he noticed were like, the breasts that it had.
Mm-hmm.
Well, critics of the Patterson-Gimlin like to talk about, well, hey, there's no ape that has a hairy breast like this one in this film. That's like pretty much. And then, obviously it's like, where's the body, type stuff, right? But what do you say? Like, what's the...
Yeah. Well, to all the ladies out there, the next time you step out of the shower and there's a little cool draft, just notice the distribution of goosebumps across your chest, your bust line, and you'll find that your breasts are covered with goosebumps. What is a goosebump? It's the action of a little erector pili muscle that's attached to the base of a hair follicle. So everywhere there's a goosebump, there's a hair. Even if it's very fine or non-existent, there still is a follicle there with a little muscle attached that causes the skin to pucker up when that muscle contracts in an effort to cause hair to stand on end when we're cold or when we're afraid. That axiom that primates have breasts bereft of hair is baseless. It's baseless. There's hair all across a chimpanzee's chest. Look at the distribution of hair in male pattern hairiness or hirsutism I just went blank. The term having to do with the steroids, and if a female has excessive testosterone and begins to have secondary hair growth across the chest, the arms, the legs, the face, there's hair. There are hair follicles that are sensitive to androgens. You look at a chimpanzee, there's hair. People have this image of a gorilla costume where the hair is very short and it looks as though the chest is bare.
Yeah, like almost like a gladiator chest plate.
Exactly. So in a costume, they just put that bare. But it's silly. There are others. For example, what happened, again, imagine this, because most of these statements stemmed from the members of the panel at the Smithsonian that had just viewed the film in 1967 or 68.
So we're talking specifically about skepticism arising after this panel viewing at the time.
Yeah.
Roughly right after it was filmed.
Many of the statements that you see circulating still emanated from these. So, for example, John Napier was a primatologist, Smithsonian. He was a British physician / a PhD, but he was also had been a practicing physician with specialties in the hands and feet. And the footprints really impressed him. He eventually wrote a book in the wake of his viewing of the film. He was more open-minded to the possibility, but still in his book, he still came out, as with all his colleagues, thumbs down.
Yeah.
In his book, he said, there really wasn't one particular thing, except the fact that from the waist up, this figure looked essentially like an ape, but from the waist down, it was human-like in proportions. And he said, it's almost impossible for me to conceive of such a hybrid of structure to exist in nature. So one part or the other must have been contrived. Well, obviously, that means it's a fake. It's a costume of some kind.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting because his book came out in 1972. Just a few years later, we were talking about the discovery of Lucy. And for the first time, we had skeletal remains of these little diminutive bipedal hominins associated with crania that were much more extensive than before. And it was clear that they had, pelvises and knees and so forth that were very human-like. And how did they describe it to the press? They said, well, from the waist up, she looks like a chimpanzee. From the waist down, she looks like a human. Well, now, wait a minute. That inconceivable combination of traits was the linchpin in Napier's rejection of the film. What if he had waited another 5 years before he published his book, before he wrote up his thoughts on the film? Because that's exactly what we see on the film, is the very combination they thought was inconceivable. There was one I can't remember which one said it now. Strauss, was it? I can't remember, but he said, oh, it's so silly. They put breasts on this costume, and yet it clearly walks like a man. Well, how does a human female walk differently than a human male? The wider pelvis creates more tilt to the pelvis with each step. When support is entirely over 1 foot, of support, while the other leg is swinging, there's a greater distance that causes the pelvis to tilt further. In males, that's less exaggerated because the hip joints are closer together. Why? Because females have an enlarged birth canal, because we give birth to large-brained babies. Apes have small brains. Male and female pelvises are actually difficult to differentiate because there's not much difference in the birth canal. There really isn't much difference at all. And so conceivably, the Sasquatch, from what we see on the film, has a brain about the size of a gorilla relative to body mass. So its babies are small-brained. Its females don't have wide hips. Ergo, they walk like a human male, not a human female, which is the outlier, the different one. So point after point after point of these objections just have no bearing. If they would have thought it through, the implications of their statements, then they would have recognized, they were embarrassing then. They're even more embarrassing to reflect on them now. So there's all kinds of objections that have been raised, directed at the film, which, upon a little reflection, it's very easy to address them, and they're very.
Where did Patterson and Gimlin end up on this, later in their lives?
Right.
Because I don't know. I'm not asking you a question that I know the answer to.
Mm-hmm.
You could tell me that they all said that it was fake, and Uncle Ned was in the costume.
Yeah.
Or you could tell me that they took it to their graves. I don't know.
Right. Well, Roger died of leukemia some years later, and did take it to his grave, despite urban legends that he had a deathbed confession. No, he was adamant. I've visited with his wife. It's fun to hear her. Or interesting, fun in the sense of fun, enlightening.
Yeah.
To hear her, my question was, what was he like when he got home from this trip? And to hear her describe her recollections of his, it was basically, he was so excited. He was still, even days later, he was still
wired,
bouncing off the walls, wired as what had happened. Bob Gimlin is still alive. And in fact, this October, I'm going up to Yakima. They're celebrating his birthday, and in conjunction with an event there. And I'll be talking again about the film in that context. But I
talked to him?
Oh yeah. We're good friends. I mean, I'm not the kind of I haven't many close friends, and I'm not the kind who picks up the phone and talks to my acquaintances.
Somebody and tells them secrets and stuff.
Well, yeah. So but we're good friends on good terms. You know, it was interesting. One time that he and I and a third person, they had a great program up at the Washington State Historical Society Museum. It was called Sasquatch, the Stories, the Sightings, and the Science. So they had a native storyteller. They had Bob Gimlin for the sightings. She was the stories. He was the sightings, and I was the science. And it made a great program.
That is cool. And
so each had our own presentations and panel. But he and I were staying at the same hotel. She was the storyteller. I can't think of her name, but she was local. And so we took our meals together, you know, and had spare time. And we hardly talked about Bigfoot at all.
Oh, really?
All the conversations were about family and the places we've traveled to and the jobs we've had, what cities we've lived in. And, you know, the relationship had gotten to that level where we'd answered all our questions. I've heard him tell the story so many times.
So what does still alive Bob Gimlin have to say?
Oh, he tells the story the same. And he, you know, there was one occasion when a guy who has the money to do it, if he really intended to, but he's a producer, Doug Hychek. He actually produced Sasquatch Legend Meets Science, the documentary that my book was based upon in part. But he basically said, look, you know, I can't remember what the actual figure was, $100,000 or whatever, $500,000. He said, Bob, if you'll give me the exclusive rights to your confessional to this.
I'll give you $500,000?
Yeah. And Bob just looked at him and says, I'd love to take your money. He says, but that's not how it happened. You know, this really happened. This is what we saw. And, you know, you can't spend 5 minutes with the guy. And he's that kind of guy who's just the salt of the earth. He's just as, you know, there is no guile. He just, you know, he gets rankled when at the accusations. And his wife, you know, he kind of dropped under the radar afterward because he endured so much persecution. And his wife, at her place of work, her occupation, she received all kinds of harassment to the point that almost led to their divorce, to a divorce. Thankfully, didn't, but. There was a lot of abuse heaped on them by local people and beyond. But and then eventually there was an event at the Willow Creek Museum where they had built an addition to house Bob Titmus's collection of casts and other artifacts, including that collection of 10. But he had others. Bob spent a lot of time in the field, and he actually got some really interesting examples. And on that occasion, the organizer, one of the organizers, prevailed with convincing Bob to come out and share his story. And he did, first time in years. And it was so well received. He was treated like, you know, like royalty or a rock star, whichever you want. Because people were so fascinated. There were so many people like myself who were there because of having originally seen that film when it came out and the impact that it had on their lives, that he has since made many appearances at these various conferences. He's getting to the point where he's not able to do that. Yeah.
Well, you might have to see about getting him on the old computer, man.
Yeah.
On the horn. That might be fun.
It would, definitely.
So through the magic of editing, all of a sudden there's a dog here, and that's because that dog was barking outside me as I let him in. He's interested in the cast too.
Yeah.
Oh, Mr. Boone. So in talking about, you know, Bob Gimlin's time in the field, you also have spent a bunch of time in the field.
Right.
I'm curious about a couple things. One, and I actually know the answer to this one, I'd like to know how you guys define potential Bigfoot habitat
Oh,
and population densities. We talked briefly about it on the phone. I happen to like that. I don't know why.
Yeah.
The other thing that I'd like to know would be, what sort of methods do you use for collecting evidence beyond footprints, and what sort of results have you gotten?
Okay.
So,
well, the first one, there was a paper that came out, an editorial that was published in the Journal of Biogeography, I believe. And one of the authors was an acquaintance of mine. He was a past student of the University of Colorado, where he did his honors thesis on a GIS, Geographic Information Systems, application to the distribution of Sasquatch reports in the Pacific Northwest over a 20-year period, to try to determine if there was any correlation with population growth in urban centers like Seattle, Tacoma, Metropolitan, and Vancouver, Portland. Anyway, not to spend too much time on that, but he was with two co-authors writing a editorial admonishing researchers of population biology and ecology not to rely too blindly on prepackaged ecological modeling software that was off the shelf. Mm-hmm. And so, basically you can't just treat this like a black box and not know what the algorithms are doing. It's like the old adage, garbage in, garbage out. So to demonstrate the potential pitfalls of undue reliance on these software packages, they set out to test some ostensibly bogus data, namely Bigfoot data that this guy was familiar with from his time and research previously, and his interest in Bigfoot persists. But the outcome was a remarkably coherent model of Sasquatch habitat, which interestingly and not surprisingly, really upon reflection, paralleled habitat and the parameters defining that habitat for black bear. And so they tongue-in-cheek, their conclusion was tongue-in-cheek, well, there's the answer.
Black bear habitat is Bigfoot habitat?
Well, no, the Bigfoot sightings are black bear encounters.
Oh, okay, I understand.
Because the coincidence is just because you're just putting a bear in ape clothing, basically. Yeah. And so I reached out to him and I said, hey, what gives here? I thought you were more open-minded about the subject matter, or more convinced even. And he said, Jeff, nothing's changed. He said, you have to realize if we even intimated that our results indicated a rational model for Bigfoot's existence, it would never be published. Our paper would have been rejected. So we had to kind of adopt this tongue-in-cheek sort of backhanded approach to it. He said, however, I'll have you know my two co-authors entered into this project very skeptical about Bigfoot, and in contrast to me. And he said, but now after seeing these results and working through these data sets, they're quite intrigued. And he said, in fact, I have them reading your book. So what this gives us then is an interesting, if this can be extrapolated across the continent,
that good black bear habitat is good Bigfoot habitat.
And it makes sense given two large omnivore species. Now, again, using that competitive exclusion principle, they probably, large omnivore niche is a real broad brushstroke. Yeah. You could partition, you could define, and the fact that a black bear is evolved from probably a more canid carnivore ancestor. And so it has some of that legacy that shows up in their snout, in their canines, in their reduced carnassial, the shearing, their teeth have spread out a bit. But they also have a very simple digestive tract, especially the colon, is nothing by comparison to, say, a great ape that has a lot of fermentation. And
sorry, the dog's a skeptic.
yeah, no, that's all fine. Sasquatch would be derived from a frugivore-folivore ancestor, has a totally different chewing apparatus, probably a different physiology as well as morphology, including a very large colon for fermentation and reduction of secondary compounds and detoxification and so forth, and digestion of cellulose. It may even practice coprophagy, as some apes do, to have a second pass at digesting that vegetative material. Yeah. Well, if you've ever had a pet rabbit, the rabbits produce two kinds of pellets. Yeah. There's the black ones that they leave behind, but then they also produce these, if they've been fed grass or straw or hay or whatever, they produce one that looks like just literally compressed grass.
Yeah.
And those they gobble back down even while they're still hot and steamy, because there's still a lot of potential to digest.
Yeah, I don't want to think about Bigfoot
not before
eating
dinner.
A Bigfoot turd, man.
I could share a story with you you'd love.
Oh yeah, what's that?
I taught a course. I've taught it several times in survey of living primates, and the students do a project. But anyway, the short of it is, they could do either a library research type of a project, or they could do one that involved more behavioral observation and so forth. So one fellow was down at the Hogle Zoo, and they have great apes, they have gorillas, and he said, I've got to show this video to the class. It's great. So this big old silverback sidles over to the plexiglass plate. He's looking at these people, and he picks his nose, and all of a sudden he reaches back.
Oh no.
It just looked just like cooked spinach. And it's, it's steaming away, and he looks at it, and then he just goes into it. And you can hear the onlooker's reaction, which is very similar to yours. And the little kids are, oh no, he's eating it. He's eating. And then the creme de la creme was when he's finished, he looks at his hand and he goes. So it was a great example of this behavior.
Yeah.
And when you understand the biology behind it, it may be that Sasquatch do that as well. But
so you're saying that you don't find a lot of Bigfoot turds?
Well, no, eventually you have to leave it. You can't recycle it perpetually. Right. So yes, I know. It doesn't reduce the number at all.
So what you've told me that you land on about, for every 200 black bears in suitable habitat, one Sasquatch.
One Sasquatch, yes.
How did you land at that number?
Well, I came at it, tried to do it more methodically, and so I considered the clues that we have about the social structure that Sasquatch might exhibit, and everything kind of points to them being solitary, more like an orangutan. Amongst the great apes, there are no two species that have the same social structure, but there's kind of the principal difference between the large-bodied apes and the chimps and bonobos is that in the case of the gorillas, the dominant male monopolizes females. In the case of the orang, the dominant male monopolizes real estate that happens to overlap that of several females who seek out his company when they are so inclined, which is rare. Births in orangutans occur only 6 to 8 years apart from one another. So humans have we sort of altered that for more rapid production to where, even nursing doesn't necessarily suppress ovulation, although certainly not a reliable form of birth control. But so solitary. So imagine then, and then having worked with other GIS specialists who looked at data, looked at distribution, we looked at repeat appearances of recognizable individuals based on their footprints. A home range on the order of about 1,000 square miles. Now that's not unreasonable. In fact, if you look at modern hunter-gatherer societies today, 1,000 square miles is about the median value. Yeah. So, that's only 30 miles, 30 plus by 30 plus, and you can cross that in a couple of days. And so especially if your resources are patchy and distributed and so on. Anyway, so using all these variables and then looking at the landforms, looking at the forest coverage, looking at the precipitation, how productive is the forest? You need to have about 18 inches of rainfall per year or more. And then looking at black bear distribution in a given state. Then using that notion of about 1,000 square miles for a social unit, how many of those can we fit into that available habitat? So I haven't done it for Montana for a long time, but Idaho, I come up with about 15. And this is just again, we're spitballing.
Is that 15 Sasquatch or 15 family groups?
Social units, yeah. So each social unit, 5 to 7-ish. And it's going to vary. I mean, it's not going to be uniform, and the topography and the patchiness of the habitat.
Have you ever done like a North American estimation?
Well, if you just take the black bear, and so this is the thing. You can if you do it this way first and see what you come up with. So if you had 15 units times, let's say 5, so that's 75. No, wait a minute. Yeah, 75 Sasquatch. If you look at the black bear population and divide it by 200, in Idaho there's 35,000, so 30 to 35,000. So we're talking about 175. So we're in the ballpark. The point is there's only a couple hundred Sasquatch versus the 35,000 black bear. So think about the rarity of encounters with black bear, the rarities of finding sign of black bear, but then divide that by 200 for Sasquatch. So you can see why encounters are by chance. They're happenstance. They're, few of us who go out and intentionally look for evidence ever find it.
Tell me about what it looks like when you go out and intentionally look for evidence. What are some tools that you use and what are some things that you found?
Well, obviously you do a lot of prep work looking at Google Earth and looking at maps and if you have access to a GIS tech, you can maybe look for what might be some key food resources, particular berries like hawthorn berry or something like that, and look at the distribution. It's not as nearly as uniform as you think it might be out there. And then when you're out, I mean, some people think you have to do the night time. The fact of the matter is the only statistical analysis we have, or summary, not even an analysis, John Green, who collected lots and lots and lots of reports back before the digital age, he shows as many reported encounters in daylight as at nighttime. His argument was then, since human activity is greatly reduced and our ability to see at night is greatly reduced, to have equal number of encounters would suggest there's probably a lot more activity at night than there is in the daytime. But it's not exclusive. So this creature is quite versatile. Or maybe it's kind of crepuscular, like bears are active in dawn and dusk kind of primarily. So I lost my train of thought. What we do when we go out. So I'm not a huge fan of spending a lot of time out at night. I have, but
how come you're not a huge fan? This is the one time you thought you saw a Bigfoot.
I know, but it wipes you out if you
just. You don't like the. All right.
I'm not a night person, and so if I stay up all night long, then I'm shot for the next day or two. Yeah. It seems it throws me so out of whack. Plus, I think you should do it. You should experience it.
Yeah.
And there's something to be said for it. But if you're going out to look for sign, I mean, basically, then you're sitting there hoping that the moving needle in the haystack bumps into you.
Yeah.
Or if you're out walking along a trail, or whatever you're doing, you're making a thin slice through potential opportunities for encounters.
Okay.
So the daytime, I think if you're out to cut sign, because obviously if you're not finding sign,
right.
It's like one time I was working with a gentleman who was financing a project, and I was sort of there as the consultant, as the participant. But one time we were going to do some prospecting up in central Idaho finally. And because one of his shortcomings, in my opinion, was he was kind of like a butterfly, and we flitted around. He liked to respond to areas where there were reports or a particular witness that he was not enamored with, but was intrigued by.
Yeah.
Put it that way. He picks me up. We were going to just take the one vehicle, and I'm in the front seat there with him, and so as we're driving off, he turns to me and he says, "So, Jeff, what do you think our odds are this time?" I said, "Well, pull over at that KB Quick Stop up there and let's buy a few scratch cards and I'll talk about what our odds are." I said, we can have, it's like playing the lotto or doing the scratch cards. You have about as much chance, but if you don't ever buy one, don't ever buy a lotto ticket, you're never going to win. The more you buy, the better your chances are to win. I said, but we can have all our ducks in a row. We can have everything ready. We can have done all of our homework. I've picked out a really great area. It was along what's called Sandy Creek because it had all these exposed sandbars all down. I thought, great for tracking. We can have everything, but these things are rare.
Yeah.
1,000 square miles. We're not going to cover 1,000 square miles. It could be just over the ridge in the next drainage for the 10 days that we're over here, and we'll never see sign of it. Any fresh sign anyway.
Yeah.
And so that's how fickle it is to go out here. And that's why I tell, whenever I encounter people who are the weekend warriors, I respect them for that. But the ones that are going out there and they have activity on a weekly basis.
That makes you skeptical.
Me skeptical, yeah. Because they're reporting bumps in the night. Something was watching them. They heard a tree knock. They saw a structure. They have no footprints. They have no hair. They have no vocalization recordings. They have no sightings.
Yeah.
No nests.
So what do you do? I mean, you must do camera traps or hair traps.
So other
surveys.
things, yeah, exactly. So yeah, we've tried the various trail cameras. It's interesting now that in the literature, there's actually quite a lot of interest in the level of awareness of animals to camera traps being placed. And they've discovered that, whether it's light emissions, whether it's EM emissions, whether it's scent, whether it's the novelty of something placed in their habitat. It's like if someone set a box, on your coffee table here, you came walking in, that's probably the first thing you would notice is that
where'd that box
unexpected box, yeah. And so even if they're camouflaged, the very act of camouflaging still creates a novelty, And there have been some really stunning images captured where they've put cameras out and then the animals have immediately picked up on them. So never have had any success with camera traps so far. Some people have had some interesting, rather equivocal, but never the money shot. We have tried hair snags, but again, when you have an animal that doesn't seem to respond to scent or bait attractants, or maybe it's not that they aren't responsive, but there just aren't enough of them for you to make contact in the short window of time you're in the field. And it's not something you can leave. Well, you can leave it out for a certain period of time. But we've tried the things with the brass,
little piece of barbed wire.
Bristles on barbed wire. We created ones that had barbless fish hooks that were untempered, so they wouldn't break off in the skin or anything, but just would bend, but would scratch, and
trying to get DNA.
And back braided them into wire and festoon it with moss. And I'll tell you hang those things up there. And then the strategy is we'd hang a bright, shiny, sparkly.
Something for them to get at.
So that they're reaching up and that exposes this thin skin.
Do you get a lot of bobcats messing with those things?
Well, we didn't because we never. And see,
how high were they?
Well, and the
very athletic bobcat.
Amount of time we've deployed them has been very limited. Since I'm operating through the university, under the auspices of the university, very conscientious about getting permits and permissions and so forth. And the agency personnel are very, for the very reason you bring up, are very skeptical about deploying one of those. And in fact, the one time we got permission, it was
because they don't want cats,
other wildlife getting caught up in them, tangled in them. They allowed us to deploy them only on the with the understanding that we were doing it in response to other trace evidence. So if we found footprints of Sasquatch, then we were justified. But just to hang them out willy-nilly all over the place, they didn't want that to take place. So,
have you found anything compelling doing that?
No, we've not gotten hair samples from those techniques. Not that we haven't found hair on occasions, and others have submitted hair. I mean, that's one of the things I do. The person who was our point man, he was a microscopist at the Oregon Regional Primates Center in Beaverton, Oregon, who took an interest in this. And everything that we was submitted to me, I would immediately redirect to him. He's now retired and spends all his time looking through a telescope instead of a microscope down in Arizona or Texas now. I think he moved to Texas. But anyway, so I've taken over. So I get samples. So we have hair that is remarkably consistent. And the only other thing it could be is human hair. One of the distinguishing features is the lack of a cellular medulla, that central bar or band down the center of the shaft. And that only occurs rarely in humans, particularly very light blonde toe-headed individuals. But across, we have hair that spans the spectrum from almost white to mahogany black, and every one of them have the exact same morphological dimensions, cuticle structure, lack of a cellular medulla, all the way across. And these span from Alaska to Texas, collected independently. And yet they all are remarkably similar, grown to length, blunt tip wear. And, but the lack of the cellular medulla means it's very difficult to get DNA because the remnants of the cells from the follicle are in that medulla.
Oh, I see.
And
okay,
those
that was
without
my next
a medulla,
question.
the cells don't migrate up in the shaft. It's just all extruded keratin protein. And so
it's hard to get a conclusive.
It's hard to get. And those rare times, and then on top of that, the rare times we have gotten DNA, invariably, the outfit that does the research, which typically oftentimes it's underwritten by a documentary. And so they just do a cursory mitochondrial gene, which if even a whole gene. And so the result comes back as human. And the conclusion is, well, it was either mishandled and contaminated, or it's simply a human hair that's been misattributed to a Sasquatch. But the other possibility that I argue is you haven't sequenced enough. These creatures may be so similar to us, if they're a hominin, they could be much closer than a chimpanzee. So we could be different by 0.5%, 0.25% of the nucleotide sequence. And so if you're just doing a couple of thousand bases on a very conservative mitochondrial gene,
you wouldn't notice.
It wouldn't, It's just going to look human. And that's what it lines up with because it's identical. You need to have the whole genome to find those rare. Now, in real interesting development, we were discussing this in a Q&A panel at a recent conference held in Pocatello. One of my colleagues, one of the few colleagues who's very sympathetic, very supportive, very familiar with genetics. He's an anatomist / teratologist, looks at birth defects, and the genetic basis of birth defects. He said, you're potentially dealing with such a fraction of the DNA sequence, but if you look at, say, the comparison between chimp and human chromosomes, even though they only differ by a few percentage points, 2, 3, 4 percentage points, they have significant inversions of the chromosome arms that you can identify with banding stains. And so he said, what you need to do is to look at these samples for chromosomal aberrations rather than sequence. Problem is there aren't many people that still do this kind of research anymore because everything is, sequencing is so automated. And so, but
I said, yeah, like I knew what you were talking about,
no,
but like,
no, I know what you.
well, so one thing that has never been found was any sort of bones, any sort of carcass, but I understand that you do have something that's reflective of what one of those may look like.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Well,
I'm going to warn you right now. The dog is not about to like this.
Oh, yeah, he might not.
That's all right.
To the question of the origins of Sasquatch, a popular candidate that was proposed quite early on was Gigantopithecus, which is an ape species that existed in Eastern Asia.
I guess he likes it a lot, actually.
During the Pleistocene. And this was, again, part of that Pleistocene megafauna that we've mentioned, this being a primate representative. So this creature, which we now know from 4 isolated jaws, for the longest time, up until just a couple of years ago, it was 2.
Is that what that's represented of?
Yes.
Above the texture? Those are things that have actually been found.
Exactly.
And the rest is super...
Right. And so Dr. Grover Krantz, who's a great forensic anthropologist in his own right, and does reconstructive models like this for other hominins and great apes. So based on the jaw, he then extrapolated the lower jaw, if we know its depth and girth and so forth, the upper has to reflect that to have the attachments for the musculature that drive those heavy jaws and huge teeth. You have to have sufficient points of attachment, assuming that this creature, as a great ape, would have a brain not much different in proportion than a gorilla. That doesn't provide enough attachment area for this large of an animal, so you've got a sagittal crest, as well as these very beam-like, very deep zygomatic arches for the attachment of the masseter muscle. So the 2 principal muscles are the masseter here, under their cheek there, and the temporalis that you can feel. We have just a thin layer on the side. I mean, it's really impressive when you look at it from here. That whole depth, that whole space here is filled with the temporalis muscle. So the appeal of this model, this hypothesis, is you've got a species that's the right size, in the right place, at the right time. The problem is...
Can I see this thing?
Yeah. The problem is we don't have skeletal elements that betray whether it was bipedal or quadrupedal, maybe like a gorilla or a chimpanzee.
Yeah.
So if someone walks out of a cave in southern China with a femur, a thigh bone that has a valgus angle and the shape of the knee joint that suggests upright posture, we've got it nailed. Then we know there was a bipedal giant ape that existed through the Pleistocene until as recently as possibly 200,000 years ago by the known fossil record, if not to the present. It may be that Sasquatch has only been in this continent for a couple 100,000 years, not millions of years. I mean, it just depends on when that land bridge was appropriate for a forest-dwelling ape to expand its home range from Asia into North America.
In your estimation, do you think that we are ever going to have definitive proof? Or I would assume ever would be kind of like long. Do you think that in the next 50 years, how surprising would it be to you to find out that or to find concrete evidence? Maybe not you find concrete evidence, but have one find.
It wouldn't be surprising in the least. I mean, it'll either happen, surreptitiously or serendipitously, with a hunter shooting one, a truck driver running over one, or a spelunker, avocational spelunker, happened to
Oh my God.
find a skull.
Oh, okay. Well,
in a cave.
That's a lot better than finding a Sasquatch in a cave as a spelunker. That would be terrifying.
Well, I don't think, just as with Gigantopithecus, they didn't occupy the caves their bones are found in, but rather porcupines dragged them into those caves to chew them up into the limestone caves, where then the remains, the thickest parts of the jaws and the
stuff that they can't get through.
Right. They were then fossilized in those limestone cave deposits. If you don't have porcupines to concentrate the bones, or you don't have limestone caves, the bones exposed to the scavengers and gnawers and chewers and elements, the acidic soils of a coniferous, wet forest, they don't survive very long. So it's not surprising that we don't have fossilized remains yet. But no, it wouldn't surprise me in the least. I hope, I cross my fingers that it happens in my lifetime. I would like to see that culmination.
I hope that for you too. What if a Bigfoot was found tomorrow?
Yeah.
And you got to address all your skeptics at once? What is your messaging to them?
Oh, I'd be very magnanimous. I would. No, I there's a few select individuals I would certainly dish up an extra serving of crow.
Yeah, you have your general public statement, and then you have your private phone call.
Yeah. No, I mean, it will speak for itself. And if I have the good fortune to be included, I mean, that's the thing. Everyone will jump on the bandwagon, and there'll be all these high-profile academics who say, "Oh, I knew it all along," and that'll swoop in and take over. I'm always reminded of the movie Contact, with I should have left it.
Andrew, you're a movie guy.
Contact.
Is that with Jodie Foster?
Jodie Foster, thank you. Yes. And the other guy that was her boss, and I can't remember his name either, but that's the thing. She finds this signal. She's done all the work. She's put her career on the line. And then when they find the signal and they actually decode it, he swoops in and he kind of dominates. And he gets chosen as the one to go into the device to make contact, but he gets killed. He gets his just desserts. I won't wish that on anyone, but...
Well, I really appreciate you coming on and talking with us. Floor is yours, man. Do you got anything to tell folks about out there in YouTube or listener land? Any events, books?
Well, certainly my book is the place to start, and it's not intimidating. Some people joke with me that they had to have a dictionary beside them while they read it. It's not really quite the case. A couple chapters maybe.
The two things that you just said are kind of standing in stark contrast to each other.
But I will say there's 150 illustrations. I'm a very visual teacher and learner, and so I like to portray the evidence visually, and so it pulls you in. But it is, even though it's a little dated, it was published in 2006. It still is the primer. It's the place to start. That's Sasquatch Legend Meets Science. You can find it on Amazon or in Barnes & Noble or other bookstores. There are other publications, but to keep it short, I would direct people to the Relict Hominoid Inquiry. This is the title of an online scholarly journal that I edit with the assistance of a editorial board that consists of 12 bona fide PhDs or professionals in appropriate disciplines or skill sets. And we're in our 13th year. So it's well established, it's open access. It's a registered, legitimate journal with peer review, research manuscripts, technical papers, in-depth essay-style book reviews, news and commentary. There are historical documents, archived, as well as translation of foreign papers and articles of relic hominoids around the world. Great resource, and also profusely illustrated. Since we're online, we don't have page limitations, or we don't have color restrictions. I always encourage the editors to include lots of illustrative material, because not only does it make the papers more engaging, but then we actually kind of archive then some of those key illustrations and figures that way. But it makes the articles very engaging. And that can be found if you just Google the Relict Hominoid Inquiry or even RHI.
But Relict with a T.
With a T. Relict with a T. Hominoid. Not hominid, but it'll get you there. It's on the ISU server, so it's www.isu.edu/RHI. If you can't remember that, just Google.
Oh, we'll put it in the show notes.
Great.
We'll put it in the show notes.
But those, you can educate yourself. You can put your finger on the pulse of new evidence, new directions of research.
All right. Well, thank you, Dr. Meldrum.
Absolutely.
I really appreciate you coming on. What do you think?
Great. No,
Great.
it was
Man,
fun.
It was so much fun. Look at this. I can't believe how heavy this thing is.
Yeah.
Everybody, thanks for watching this episode of the Backcountry Manifesto podcast. If you want more Backcountry Manifesto, go ahead and check out one of these links right here. And make sure to share the podcast with your friends, comment, like, subscribe, do all that good stuff. It really helps us out. Again, thank you very much for watching. Now go check out one of these things. I like this one. This one was a good episode, I promise.